The city lay wrapped in darkness, the kind that settles deepest just before morning, when even the guards grow tired and the streets belong to shadows. A thin mist clung to the cobblestones, blurring the edges of buildings and swallowing the sound of footsteps. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the passing of another hour, dull and hollow, as if the city itself sensed what was coming. Then the torches appeared. They moved in lines, dozens of them, flickering orange against the stone walls, carried by armed men who spoke little and walked with purpose. Their boots struck the ground in unison, not the chaotic noise of a riot, but the controlled rhythm of authority. Royal soldiers, clerks with sealed documents tucked under their cloaks, men who had been sworn to silence, their orders memorized, their doubts buried. This was not a raid born of panic or haste. It was precise, calculated, planned months, perhaps years, in advance. As the torches spread through Paris, doors were broken open across the city. Heavy wooden gates, reinforced with iron, gave way to crowbars and battering rams. Inside, men were dragged from their beds, some elderly, some scarred veterans of distant wars, some still half asleep, blinking in confusion as chains were fastened around their wrists. They were Knights Templar, men who had once stood at the heart of Christendom's wars, men who had guarded pilgrims on blood-soaked roads to Jerusalem, men who answered not to kings but to God alone, or so they believed. On this night, none of that mattered. By sunrise on Friday, October 13th, 1307, hundreds of Templars across France had been arrested. By the end of the day, thousands more would follow. The charges were monstrous. Heresy, blasphemy, idol worship, unspeakable rituals whispered about in secret. Confessions would come quickly. Confessions torn from mouths by pain, by fear, by the knowledge that resistance was useless. But as the arrests unfolded, a strange and troubling realization began to surface among royal officials. The treasuries were empty. The vaults beneath Templar commanderies, once rumored to hold unimaginable wealth, were bare or nearly so. Chests that should have been filled with gold coins, silver bars, and sacred relics stood open, holding nothing but dust and echoes. Account books were missing, records gone. The wealth of Europe's most powerful order had vanished as if it had never existed. And then came the most unsettling discovery of all. At the great port of La Rochelle on France's Atlantic coast, the royal agents found deserted docks. The Templars' ships, entire fleets they were known to maintain, were simply gone. No sails on the horizon, no crews waiting, no sign of hurried departure or violent struggle. Just empty water and unanswered questions. The sea, it seemed, had swallowed them whole. This was no coincidence. The arrests had been coordinated with extraordinary secrecy. Sealed letters delivered to local officials with strict orders not to open them until the night before the operation. Even many members of the church had been kept in the dark. The plan was meant to be total, overwhelming, and unavoidable. Yet somehow the Templars had known, or at least some of them had. That knowledge, how it traveled, who carried it, and when it was understood, would become one of the greatest mysteries of medieval history. Because for the ships to be gone, for the treasure to be removed, for key members of the order to escape, there had to be warning. And warning implies betrayal, foresight, or something far more unsettling. A hidden network operating beyond the reach of kings. As prisoners were herded into damp cells beneath Paris, the man responsible for their fate watched from a distance. King Philip IV of France, later called the Fair, was a ruler obsessed with control. Tall, cold-eyed, and relentlessly determined, Philip had spent years tightening his grip on the nobility, the church, and the economy. Wars had drained his treasury. His court was drowning in debt, much of it owed to the very men now being chained in his prisons. The Templars had become too powerful, too independent, too rich. But wealth alone does not explain the fear that haunted Philip. The order had its own fortresses, its own laws, its own loyalty. It answered directly to the Pope, bypassing kings entirely. In an age where authority flowed downward from God through crowns and thrones, the Templars were an anomaly, an armed, disciplined brotherhood that existed outside the normal hierarchy of power. To Philip, that was intolerable. Still, even he could not have predicted the silence that followed the arrests. No treasure recovered. No fleet seized. No dramatic revelation to justify the destruction he had unleashed. Instead, there was only absence. And absence can be more dangerous than evidence. As days turned into weeks, rumors spread through Europe. Some claimed the Templars had fled to Scotland, a land already excommunicated by Rome and hostile to English and French authority. Others whispered of ships sailing south, toward Portugal or beyond the Pillars of Hercules, into waters most medieval sailors feared to cross. A few dared to suggest something even more radical, that the Templars had carried their secrets across the ocean itself, far from the reach of kings and popes alike. Officially, none of this mattered. The trials continued. Under torture, broken men confessed to crimes they scarcely understood. The church, pressured and cornered, eventually dissolved the order. Its lands were redistributed. Its name was blackened. Its leaders were burned. But the ships were never found. No wreckage washed ashore. No cargo surfaced on the black market. No rival kingdom announced the capture of a lost fleet laden with gold. For an era obsessed with record-keeping and proclamation, the silence was deafening. It is tempting to imagine the medieval world as slow, clumsy, incapable of secrecy on a grand scale. Yet what happened in 1307 suggests the opposite. Somewhere, someone moved faster than the king. Someone understood what was coming and acted decisively, quietly, under cover of night. And if that is true, then the fall of the Templars was not merely an execution, it was an escape. The men who remained behind would become martyrs to history, their suffering preserved in chronicles and sermons. But those who vanished into the darkness, who boarded ships and slipped beyond the horizon, left behind something far more powerful than relics or gold. They left a question that has echoed for more than 700 years, carried forward by scholars, treasure hunters, and storytellers alike. A question whispered whenever old maps are unrolled or forgotten ports are excavated. A question that refuses to be buried alongside the bones of kings and knights. Where did the Templars' ships go? And more importantly, what were they carrying that was worth disappearing for? As the fires died down in Paris and the smoke drifted into memory, the sea kept its answer. And it has never spoken since. Long before torches cut through the fog of Paris, before prisons filled and accusations flew like poisoned arrows, the Knights Templar were almost invisible. They began not as an army, nor as a wealthy institution, but as a small group of exhausted men standing amid the ruins of a conquered city. Jerusalem had fallen to Christian forces in 1099, drenched in blood and religious fervor, yet victory brought a new problem. Pilgrims from across Europe poured into the Holy Land, eager to walk the paths of Christ, and many of them never returned. Bandits haunted the roads. Former soldiers turned mercenary preyed on the weak. The journey from the coast to Jerusalem was often a death sentence. Around 1119, 9 knights stepped forward to confront this danger. They were led by a French nobleman named Hugues de Payens, a man of modest means but intense conviction. These knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, binding themselves not to a lord or a crown, but to the protection of strangers. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a name so long and humble it almost seemed designed to be forgotten. They owned no land. They had no income. Chroniclers recorded that 2 knights sometimes shared a single horse, a detail later immortalized on the Templar seal. In a world where nobility was measured by banners and armor, the Templars wore plain white mantles and carried little more than faith and steel. Yet something about them captured the imagination of the age. They lived like monks but fought like soldiers, merging 2 paths that the medieval church had long kept separate. To kill was a sin, unless it was done in God's name. To take up arms was worldly, unless those arms defended the faithful. The Templars embodied this contradiction, and in doing so, they offered Europe something it desperately wanted: holy violence, purified by devotion. Recognition came slowly at first. For nearly a decade, the Templars existed in legal and financial uncertainty, relying on donations and goodwill. Then, in 1129, everything changed. At the Council of Troyes, with the powerful backing of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the era, the order received official approval from the Church. Bernard did more than endorse them. He reshaped them. In his writings, he cast the Templars as warriors of light, men who killed without sin because they killed evil itself. A Templar, he wrote, did not murder. He executed divine justice. This theological sleight of hand gave the order moral clarity in an age drowning in doubt. Knights across Europe listened. Nobles donated land, money, and sons. What began as 9 men soon became thousands. With papal blessing came extraordinary privileges. The Templars answered directly to the Pope, bypassing local bishops and kings. They were exempt from many taxes. They could build their own churches. They could collect income across borders. In a fractured medieval world, where authority was fragmented and travel was dangerous, the Templars became something revolutionary, an international institution. They built commanderies across Europe and the Holy Land, linked by trust, ritual, and discipline. A traveler could deposit money with the Templars in Paris and withdraw it in Acre. A pilgrim could sleep behind their walls and know he would wake alive. Kings borrowed from them. Popes relied on them. Armies marched under their protection. And still, the knights themselves lived simply. Their rule forbade luxury. Meals were eaten in silence. Clothing was plain. Personal wealth was prohibited. Any treasure belonged to the order, not the man. This contrast, individual poverty paired with institutional wealth, was both their strength and the seed of future suspicion. As the Crusades intensified, so did the Templars' role. They fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the medieval world, often forming the vanguard, the first to charge and the last to retreat. Their discipline was legendary. Retreat without orders was punishable by death. Surrender was shameful. Dying in battle was salvation. To enemies, they were terrifying. To allies, indispensable. But war is expensive. Castles had to be built and maintained. Horses had to be fed. Armor had to be forged. Fleets had to be constructed to move men and supplies across the Mediterranean. To sustain this machine, donations poured in. Lands in France, England, Iberia, and Italy were gifted to the order, their rents and harvests funding campaigns thousands of miles away. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the Templars became wealthy. Not in the way of kings who displayed gold and jewels, but in the way of institutions through assets, networks, and influence. They stored treasures for others. They managed estates. They issued letters of credit. They safeguarded relics. In time, they evolved into something no one had intended. The closest thing medieval Europe had to a multinational bank. And that transformation changed how they were seen. To the faithful poor, the Templars were protectors. To the nobility, they were useful allies. But to kings struggling with empty treasuries, they became an uncomfortable reminder of lost control. Money flowed through Templar hands without passing through royal coffers. Authority moved along Templar roads without stopping at borders. Power like that invites resentment. Still, as long as the Crusades continued, the order's purpose seemed unquestionable. Jerusalem fell and was retaken. Strongholds rose and collapsed. Generation after generation of Templars rode east, many never to return. Their cemeteries filled with men who had died far from home, believing utterly in the righteousness of their cause. Then, slowly, the world changed. By the late 13th century, the Crusader states were crumbling. One by one, Christian strongholds fell to Muslim forces. In 1291, Acre, the last major Crusader city, was lost. The Templars fought fiercely in its defense, but when the walls fell, they fell with them. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the order had no clear mission. They withdrew to Europe, bringing with them not just survivors, but archives, traditions, and memories of the East. Their headquarters moved to Paris, where their fortress, the Temple, loomed over the city as a symbol of both piety and power. And here, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. An order founded to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land now guarded wealth in the heart of Europe. Warriors trained for crusades sat idle while kings plotted wars of their own. The Templars still spoke the language of holy duty, but the world around them had moved on. Questions began to circulate. Why did monks need castles? Why did servants of poverty control so much gold? What rituals took place behind their closed doors? Why did they answer to no king? Most of these questions were fueled by ignorance and fear rather than fact. But fear has a way of growing when left unanswered. By the turn of the 14th century, the Templars stood at the height of their influence, and at the edge of their destruction. They had risen from nothing, built an empire of trust and steel, and survived nearly 200 years of war. Yet the very qualities that had ensured their success, secrecy, independence, unity, now made them vulnerable. They were too powerful to ignore, too mysterious to fully understand, and too valuable to be left alone. The stage was set. The order that had begun as 9 poor knights guarding a road would soon face an enemy far more dangerous than any battlefield. A king who saw in them not servants of God, but obstacles to his own survival. And when that confrontation came, it would not be fought with swords. It would be fought in shadows. It was vast, unpredictable, and filled with stories meant to keep children from dreaming of its horizon. Storms rose without warning. Ships vanished without explanation. Maps faded into guesswork the farther one sailed from familiar coasts. To cross the sea was to place one's life in the hands of God and would no thicker than a man's arm. Yet to the Knights Templar, the sea slowly became something else. It became a promise. From the earliest days of the Crusades, the order understood a truth that many of their contemporaries ignored. Wars in the Holy Land were not won on horseback alone. Men, weapons, food, and money had to move across thousands of miles. Roads were slow and dangerous. Borders were controlled by rival lords. But the sea, vast and open, answered to no king. Templar ships began modestly, hired transports carrying knights and pilgrims from Europe to the eastern Mediterranean. Over time, these contracts turned into ownership. The order invested in vessels built not for exploration, but for reliability, broad-hulled ships capable of carrying horses, armor, grain, and silver. They learned to read the winds, the currents, the stars. Knowledge once held by sailors and merchants became institutional memory. Ports followed ships, and ships followed ports. Across the Mediterranean, Templar harbors emerged like quiet sentinels. Marseille, Genoa, Barcelona, Acre, Cyprus. Each was linked not only by water, but by trust. A Templar captain docking in a foreign port did not arrive as a stranger. He arrived as part of a network that spoke the same prayers, followed the same rules, and recognized the same symbols carved into stone. The sea transformed the order. On land, power was fragmented. Feudal loyalties tangled every decision. A knight crossing territory needed permission, escorts, bribes. At sea, authority was simpler. A ship answered to its captain. The captain answered to the order. The order answered only to Rome, and often not even then in practical matters. This freedom was intoxicating. Templar fleets began to carry more than soldiers. They transported treasure from Europe to the Holy Land and back again. Donations given by nobles in France might be converted into coin in Italy, then shipped east to fund a campaign in Syria. Pilgrims entrusted their savings to Templar houses, knowing they could retrieve them on distant shores. The sea lanes became arteries, pumping wealth and influence through the body of the order. But beyond commerce and war, the sea offered something rarer. It offered anonymity. A knight traveling by road left traces, footprints, witnesses, records. A ship that vanished beyond the horizon left nothing but questions. Storms erased evidence. Currents scattered wreckage. The ocean was the perfect place for secrets to dissolve. The Templars did not fear this uncertainty. They embraced it. They built fortified ports not just for defense, but for control. At La Rochelle on France's Atlantic coast, the order established one of its most important naval bases. Unlike Mediterranean ports crowded with competing powers, La Rochelle faced open water. From its docks, ships could sail north toward England and the North Sea, or west into the unknown Atlantic. To most Europeans, that western horizon marked the edge of the world. To the Templars, it marked possibility. Records from the period are sparse, but what survives suggests the order maintained a surprisingly large fleet for a monastic institution. These were not royal warships with banners flying high, but practical vessels crewed by men loyal to the order. Some were knights trained for sea combat. Others were sailors hired and retained for years, sworn to silence and bound by steady pay and protection. Over time, the Templars became fluent in maritime politics. They negotiated docking rights, avoided hostile ports, and learned which waters were safest in which seasons. They understood tides long before they were mapped. They memorized coastlines not as lines on parchment, but as lived experience. This mastery gave them leverage. Kings needed ships. Merchants needed protection. Pilgrims needed passage. The Templars could provide all three, often faster and more reliably than any rival. Their neutrality, at least in theory, made them welcome in ports where royal fleets would be viewed with suspicion. And yet, they were never truly neutral. Their loyalty was to the order, and the order's interests were global. When necessary, ships could disappear from one region and reappear in another, carrying cargo no customs official would ever inventory. Chests sealed with wax and stamped with the Templar cross passed through harbors unquestioned. What lay inside was known only to a few. As decades passed, the sea became woven into the order's identity. New recruits learned not only how to fight on land, but how to survive storms, how to board enemy vessels, how to move silently at night. Naval warfare was brutal and chaotic, but the Templars approached it with the same discipline that governed their lives ashore. They also learned when not to fight. Retreat by land was dangerous, humiliating, often impossible. Retreat by sea was strategic. A fortress lost inland could be replaced. A ship lost at sea could not. Preservation mattered as much as courage. Survival was not cowardice. It was preparation for the next command. This philosophy would matter later, when survival became the only command left. The sea also shaped how the Templars thought about time and distance. News traveled slowly by horse, but ships could outrun rumors. A decision made in Paris could be acted upon in Portugal or England before word reached a rival court. Information, like treasure, flowed along maritime routes the order understood better than anyone else. By the end of the 13th century, the Templars had become something unprecedented. A land-based military order with a maritime soul. Their castles guarded roads and borders, but their ships connected continents. Their power did not sit in one place. It moved, and moving power is difficult to destroy. This reality did not go unnoticed. Kings watched with unease as Templar vessels docked and departed without explanation. Church officials wondered what prayers were said aboard ships far from any altar. Merchants grumbled about competition they could not match. Envy, suspicion, and fear gathered like clouds on the horizon. Still, as long as the Crusades offered justification, the order's naval strength was tolerated, even praised. Without Templar ships, armies would starve. Without their ports, pilgrims would perish. The sea had become their sanctuary, and sanctuaries were respected. But sanctuaries can also become escape routes. When the Holy Land was finally lost, and the order returned to Europe with its fleets intact, a subtle shift occurred. The ships no longer served a distant war. They waited, maintained, quietly upgraded, anchored in ports like La Rochelle, where access to the Atlantic offered options no one spoke about openly. Options that did not require permission. In retrospect, this was the moment the mystery began to take shape. Not in 1307, but decades earlier, when the Templars realized that their greatest strength was not their swords or their gold, but their ability to move unseen. The sea had taught them that borders were illusions, that authority weakened with distance, and that disappearance was sometimes the most powerful act of all. So when the order finally faced its greatest threat, it did not look inward for safety. It looked to the water, and the water, vast and indifferent, was ready to receive them. In the medieval world, wealth was not just a measure of comfort or status. It was power made tangible. It decided who raised armies, who built cathedrals, who bent the will of bishops and kings alike. To control gold was to shape history, and for nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar found themselves standing at the center of Europe's financial bloodstream. At first, this was never their intention. Donations came as acts of faith. A noble might gift land in Normandy to atone for sins. A widow might offer silver to ensure prayers for her husband's soul. Kings, eager to be seen as defenders of Christendom, endowed the order with estates and privileges. These offerings accumulated slowly, almost innocently, scattered across continents. But unlike most medieval institutions, the Templars did not consume their wealth where it was given. They moved it. Land in England funded walls in Acre. Harvests in France paid for horses in Syria. Coins minted in Italy were melted down and reissued thousands of miles away. The order became skilled at converting static assets into liquid resources, a talent few others possessed. This mobility changed everything. Pilgrims heading east faced constant danger, not just from bandits but from theft and extortion. Carrying large sums of money across borders was reckless. The Templars offered a solution that felt almost miraculous. A traveler could deposit funds at a Templar house in Europe and receive a coded document, a letter that could be redeemed at another Templar commandery in the Holy Land. It was, in essence, an early form of banking. The system relied entirely on trust. The letter itself held no value to anyone outside the order. Only Templar officials could read its markings, verify its authenticity, and release the funds. This trust was reinforced by reputation. The Templars were seen as incorruptible, bound by vows and divine judgment. To betray a deposit was to risk not just punishment, but eternal damnation. As confidence grew, so did usage. Merchants used Templar networks to move capital. Nobles stored family treasures in Templar vaults during times of unrest. Even the church itself relied on the order to safeguard tithes and transport funds. The Templars charged fees, modest but consistent, and reinvested profits into infrastructure, ships, and fortresses. By the 13th century, they had become indispensable. Kings borrowed heavily from them, often without fully grasping the consequences. War, especially medieval war, devoured resources. Taxes were slow to collect and politically dangerous to raise. Loans from the Templars offered immediate relief, backed by an institution that could absorb risk across borders. For a time, this arrangement suited everyone. But debt has a way of changing relationships. When a king owed money to another king, diplomacy followed. When a king owed money to the church, penance and negotiation followed. When a king owed money to the Templars, the balance of power shifted in unsettling ways. The order did not command armies for political gain, but its financial leverage was undeniable. Could delay payments, could call in debts, could refuse new loans, and perhaps most threatening of all, it kept meticulous records. Templar account books tracked who owed what, when, and under what terms. These documents represented invisible chains binding rulers to an institution beyond their control. In a world where memory was fragile and promises were easily broken, written records held terrifying authority. Rumors began to circulate. Some claimed the Templars had grown greedy, hoarding wealth meant for holy causes. Others whispered that they possessed relics of unimaginable power, fragments of the true cross, the Holy Grail, even secrets taken from the Temple of Solomon itself. While many of these stories were fantasies, they fed a growing sense that the order knew and held more than it should. Yet when royal agents finally peered into Templar vaults, they often found less than expected. The truth was subtler and more dangerous. The Templars' wealth was not concentrated in glittering piles of gold. It was dispersed, invested, and moving. Money flowed through their system like water through channels, rarely pooling long enough to be seized. This made them resilient but also suspect. Secrecy became both necessity and liability. Financial codes protected depositors from theft, but outsiders saw only closed doors and whispered exchanges. Ritual silence, a core element of Templar discipline, was mistaken for conspiracy. The very practices that made their system work became evidence, in hostile eyes, of hidden crimes. Among those watching with particular intensity was King Philip IV of France. Philip was not a reckless spender by temperament, but his reign was marked by constant financial strain. Wars with England and Flanders drained the treasury. Coinage debasements angered merchants. Taxation of the clergy sparked conflict with the Pope. At every turn, money slipped through his fingers. The Templars, meanwhile, seemed immune to the chaos. Their fortress in Paris, known simply as the Temple, stood as a symbol of unassailable stability. Within its walls lay not just the Order's reserves, but royal deposits as well. Philip himself had entrusted treasure to the Templars during periods of unrest, relying on their security even as resentment festered. Dependence breeds fear. To Philip, the Order's financial independence was an insult to royal authority. They minted no coins, yet influenced currency flows. They wore no crowns, yet commanded resources rivaling kingdoms. Worst of all, they answered to a Pope Philip increasingly viewed as an adversary. In this context, accusations of heresy and corruption found fertile ground. It did not matter whether the charges were true. What mattered was that they provided a legal and moral framework to dismantle the Order and seize its assets. The language of faith masked the hunger for control. But when the moment came, something went wrong. The expected treasure was not there. Royal officials searched commanderies across France, breaking seals and prying open chests. What they found was disappointing, even humiliating. Some coins, some silver plate, enough to justify confiscation, but nowhere near the legendary wealth whispered about in taverns and courts. The greatest prize, the centralized hoard Philip believed existed, had vanished. This absence forced an uncomfortable realization. The Templars had never kept their wealth in one place. They had designed their system to survive attack, to function even if individual nodes were destroyed. In doing so, they had created a financial network that could outlive them, and perhaps escape them. If gold and documents had been moved before the arrests, then someone had authorized that movement. Someone had known. Someone had chosen what to save and what to abandon. The implication was chilling. The Order may have sacrificed its own knights to protect something greater, or something more dangerous, because among the missing assets were not just coins and jewels, but records, contracts, debts, agreements binding Europe's most powerful figures. To lose gold was painful. To lose leverage was catastrophic. What vanished in 1307 was not merely treasure. It was control. And without it, kings like Philip were left grasping at shadows, wondering whether the true wealth of the Templars had slipped beyond reach. Not into the earth, but onto the sea, carried away in silence, beyond any throne's command. The Order that had mastered the movement of money had also mastered the art of disappearance. And history would never forgive or forget that lesson. By the early years of the 14th century, the French crown was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that could be solved with a single victory or a fortunate marriage, but a slow, grinding crisis that gnawed at authority from within. At its center stood King Philip IV, later called the Fair, a man whose calm exterior concealed an obsession with control. Philip had inherited a kingdom larger and more unified than that of many of his predecessors, but size brought expense. War was his chosen language of power, and war demanded silver, endless rivers of it. Campaigns against England, rebellion in Flanders, and the maintenance of a centralized bureaucracy drained the royal treasury faster than taxes could replenish it. Each year, the crown fell deeper into debt, and each year, Philip's tolerance for financial independence around him shrank. He responded as desperate rulers often do, by squeezing every institution he could reach. Coinage was debased, reducing its silver content and inflating prices. Merchants protested. Nobles grumbled. The Jewish communities of France were expelled, their property seized in a move that temporarily filled royal coffers while poisoning the social fabric. The Lombard bankers were targeted next. Anyone who held wealth outside the king's direct control became a threat. Yet one institution remained untouchable, or so it seemed. The Knights Templar stood apart, protected by papal privilege and revered by the public as holy warriors. Their fortress in Paris loomed over the city like a silent rebuke to royal power. Within its walls lay not only the Order's wealth, but the deposits of nobles, merchants, and even the crown itself. Philip had used the Templars as bankers, trusting them with royal funds during times of unrest. That trust curdled into resentment. To Philip, the Templars embodied everything he could not control. They crossed borders freely. They answered to a pope he increasingly viewed as an obstacle. They possessed a financial network that rivaled his own authority. And worst of all, they knew his weaknesses, not through gossip, but through ledgers. Debt is a quiet humiliation. Every loan carried a reminder that the king needed the order more than the order needed him. Repayment was slow. Interest accumulated. Negotiations became strained. In a medieval world where honor and hierarchy were paramount, this imbalance was intolerable. Philip did not act rashly. He was patient, calculating, and ruthless only when conditions were perfect. Years before the arrests, he began laying the groundwork. He cultivated alliances within the church. He pressured Pope Clement V, a Frenchman whose position owed much to Philip's influence. He allowed rumors about the Templars to circulate unchecked, knowing that suspicion was easier to ignite than to extinguish. Whispers spread through taverns and court corridors. They spoke of strange rituals conducted in secret, of initiations held behind locked doors, of oaths sworn over hidden symbols. They spoke of denial of Christ, of obscene kisses, of idols worshipped in darkness. The more grotesque the story, the more it traveled. Fear, Philip understood, did not require evidence, only repetition. These rumors were not new. Military orders had always attracted suspicion, their secrecy misunderstood by those outside their ranks. But now the whispers found a willing audience. Clergy uneasy about Templar privileges, nobles jealous of their autonomy, and merchants resentful of their competition all listened closely. Philip listened closest of all. Still, rumor alone was not enough. To destroy the Templars, he needed legitimacy. He needed the church to act, or at least to remain silent. Pope Clement V, cautious and politically vulnerable, hesitated. The charges were serious, but the evidence was thin. The Templars were popular. An open attack could fracture Christendom. So Philip created a sense of urgency. He framed the Templars not as political rivals, but as a spiritual disease infecting the heart of France. If heresy existed at such a high level, he argued, swift action was required. Delay would be complicity. He presented confessions extracted from disgruntled former members, men whose bitterness and marginalization made them useful tools. The machinery of accusation began to turn. At the same time, Philip ensured that the operation, when it came, would be absolute. He prepared sealed orders sent to royal officials across France, instructing them to arrest all Templars on a single day. The secrecy was unprecedented. Even many of the men tasked with carrying out the arrests did not know their target until the final hours. This was not justice. It was an ambush. Philip's calculation was cold and precise. By acting swiftly and everywhere at once, he would prevent resistance, escape, or coordination. The order would be decapitated before it could respond. Its assets would be seized. Its reputation would be shattered. And its debts, his debts, would vanish. At least that was the plan. What Philip did not fully account for was the Templars' capacity for foresight. Whether through informants, intuition, or a network more perceptive than he realized, the order appears to have sensed the danger. Financial records suggest unusual movements of assets in the years leading up to 1307. Ships were maintained and quietly provisioned. Documents disappeared from certain commanderies. If Philip suspected this, it only sharpened his resolve. To him, the Templars' secrecy was proof of guilt. Their independence was rebellion. Their wealth was theft, stolen not from individuals but from the crown itself. In his mind, he was not destroying a holy order. He was reclaiming what had been unjustly withheld. This self-justification mattered. Philip did not see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a reformer, a king restoring balance to a system warped by privilege. The fact that his actions conveniently solved his financial crisis was, in his view, a sign of divine approval. On the night before the arrests, Philip is said to have prayed. Whether this is true or later invention, it captures something essential about him. He believed deeply in his own righteousness. He believed history would vindicate him. But history is rarely so obedient. When the arrests were carried out, Philip watched closely. He expected resistance, perhaps even violence. Instead, he found confusion and resignation. Templars submitted to chains, trusting that truth would protect them. They underestimated their enemy. Yet as reports returned from across the kingdom, a different frustration emerged. The treasure was missing. Philip had gambled everything on the assumption that destroying the order would yield immediate financial reward. Instead, he faced the humiliating reality that the greatest prize had slipped through his fingers. The order he sought to crush had outmaneuvered him, not with armies, but with planning. In that moment, the conflict ceased to be merely political or financial. It became personal. Philip pressed the trials harder. Torture intensified. Confessions were paraded as proof. The narrative hardened. The Templars were not just corrupt, but evil. Any lingering sympathy had to be extinguished. If he could not have their wealth, he would ensure their memory was poisoned. Yet even as fires were lit and verdicts pronounced, the unanswered question lingered like a wound. Where had the wealth gone? For a king obsessed with control, the idea that someone had escaped his grasp was unbearable. The sea, distant and ungovernable, mocked his authority. Ships that did not fly his banners carried away not only gold, but defiance. In trying to consume the Templars, Philip revealed the limits of royal power. And in doing so, he ensured that the mystery of their disappearance would outlive his reign, haunting the very history he believed he commanded. There was no proclamation in the streets, no trumpet blast, no warning bell to stir the city from sleep. Paris settled into darkness as it always did, unaware that history had already been set in motion. Somewhere in the royal palace, sealed orders lay on tables, their wax unbroken, their contents known only to the king and a handful of trusted men. Across France, identical documents rested in the hands of bailiffs and sheriffs, waiting for a single moment to transform obedience into action. That moment came before dawn. Royal messengers rode through the night, delivering final confirmations. Torches were lit. Chains were prepared. Horses stamped in courtyards, their breath rising in pale clouds. The machinery of the state, usually slow and tangled in custom, moved with terrifying efficiency. Friday, October 13, 1307, had begun. In Paris, soldiers approached the temple fortress from multiple directions, cutting off exits before the guards inside could understand what was happening. Elsewhere, smaller contingents moved toward rural commanderies, monasteries, and way stations scattered across the countryside. The targets were specific. Every man bearing the Red Cross was to be taken. No exceptions. No delays. The arrests were swift and merciless. Doors were forced open. Brothers were dragged from prayer, from sleep, from morning routines unchanged for decades. Some asked for explanations. Others offered none, trusting that this was some terrible misunderstanding that would soon be resolved. They had faith in God, in the church, in the belief that truth would prevail. That faith would be used against them. By mid-morning, hundreds of Templars filled cells, barns, and makeshift holding areas. By nightfall, thousands were in chains. France had not seen such a coordinated operation in living memory. Even wars unfolded with more chaos. The charges were read aloud, their words sharp and surreal. Heresy, blasphemy, denial of Christ, worship of false idols, ritual humiliation of the cross. Acts too obscene to name openly. The accusations struck not only at the men, but at the foundation of their identity. To be called heretics was to be cut off from salvation itself. The shock was paralyzing. Most Templars had never heard these charges before. They struggled to comprehend how an order created and sanctified by the Church could suddenly be declared its enemy. Surely the Pope would intervene. Surely Rome would correct this madness. But Rome was silent. Pope Clement V had not ordered the arrests, but he did not stop them either. Caught between fear of scandal and pressure from the French crown, he hesitated. That hesitation sealed the Templars' fate. In the vacuum of papal authority, royal power rushed in. Interrogations began almost immediately. At first, the questioning was formal, almost restrained. Officials recorded names, ranks, and duties. But when denials came, as they almost always did, the tone shifted. Torture was authorized, justified as a necessary tool to extract truth from hardened heretics. The medieval mind believed pain could cleanse lies. Men were stretched on racks until joints cracked. Feet were roasted over open flames. Water was forced down throats until lungs burned. Confessions followed, as they always do under such conditions. Broken bodies produced the words their interrogators demanded. Philip had what he wanted on paper, but papers are fragile things. As confessions accumulated, a deeper problem emerged. The stories were inconsistent. Details contradicted one another. Some men confessed to acts they could not possibly have committed, in places they had never been. Others recanted as soon as the pain stopped, insisting they had lied to survive. Truth dissolved into noise. Still, the narrative hardened. The Templars were guilty. Their secrecy was proof. Their discipline was fanaticism. Their silence under questioning was arrogance. Every attempt to defend themselves was reinterpreted as further evidence of corruption. Yet amid the chaos of trials and torture, a quieter discovery spread among royal officials. The order's infrastructure had been hollowed out. Commanderies that should have been bustling with activity felt abandoned. Account books were missing or incomplete. Strongboxes stood open, their contents removed. In some places, seals had been broken days or weeks earlier, suggesting a deliberate withdrawal rather than a hurried flight. Most troubling of all were the ports. At La Rochelle and other coastal holdings, the docks were eerily calm. Ships that should have been there, ships known by name, crew, and purpose, were gone. No official departure records existed. Harbor masters claimed ignorance or swore they had been away. Fishermen spoke of sails disappearing into mist days before the arrests. The timing was impossible to ignore. The arrests had been planned in secret, sealed from all but a few. And yet, the Templars' most valuable assets had vanished just in time. Not scattered by panic, but removed with method and restraint. This realization unsettled even those loyal to the crown. If the Templars were guilty, why had they been allowed to prepare? If they were innocent, how had they anticipated a strike of such precision? The only explanation that fit the evidence was the most disturbing one. Someone had warned them. The idea of betrayal gnawed at Philip's court. Had the Pope leaked information? Had a royal clerk sold secrets? Or did the Templars possess a network so attuned to political shifts that they sensed danger without being told? None of these possibilities reflected well on the king. As days passed, Philip pressed forward, unwilling to allow doubt to slow momentum. He ordered the trials expanded beyond France, urging other monarchs to act. Some complied reluctantly. Others resisted, uneasy with the precedent being set. In England, King Edward II hesitated, demanding evidence before arresting his own Templars. In Iberia, rulers moved cautiously, aware of the order's role in defending their borders. The illusion of universal guilt fractured along political lines. Still, the damage was done. In France, the Templars' reputation lay in ruins. Public opinion shifted as confessions were read aloud, stripped of context and humanity. Fear replaced reverence. The order that had once embodied holy purpose was now seen as a nest of corruption. And yet, beneath the spectacle, the core question remained unanswered. Where was the heart of the order? The men in chains were not its entirety. They were the visible surface, the ones who had stayed, who had believed too deeply in the protection of law and faith. But somewhere beyond the reach of interrogators and fires, something had survived. Perhaps it was wealth, perhaps documents, perhaps knowledge passed orally, too subtle to be seized. Whatever it was, it had been deemed worth saving, worth abandoning brothers to torture and death. That choice, more than any accusation, defines the tragedy of that day. The fall of the Templars was not a single moment of collapse, but a fracture. Some were caught, some were lost, and some, it seems, escaped entirely, carrying with them the unresolved tension between loyalty and survival. As the weeks stretched into months, the trials dragged on, but the energy of discovery faded. There were no dramatic recoveries of treasure, no revelations that justified the violence unleashed. Only paperwork, pain, and silence. The silence of the sea. Ships that did not return. Routes that led nowhere. Horizons that offered no answers. For all his power, Philip could not command the water. He could not interrogate waves or torture the wind. The ocean had taken the final word. And in doing so, it transformed a political purge into a mystery that would outlive kings, popes, and the very world that condemned the Templars, leaving behind not closure, but a haunting sense that history itself had been outpaced. If the destruction of the Templars left a single wound in the historical record, it was carved into the harbor of La Rochelle. There, on France's western edge, where stone meets tide and the Atlantic breathes in long, patient rhythms, the absence was impossible to ignore. La Rochelle was no minor port. It was the Templars' maritime heart, a place where salt, timber, canvas, and secrecy converged. Royal agents arrived expecting chaos. Half-loaded ships, abandoned cargo, signs of panic. What they found instead was stillness. The docks were intact. Mooring ropes lay coiled, not cut. Warehouses were closed, not smashed open. The sea beyond the harbor was empty, its horizon unbroken by sails. It was as if the fleet had dissolved into the water itself. Contemporary records speak in frustratingly cautious language. Ships formerly belonging to the order could not be located. Crews were unavailable for questioning. The wording suggests confusion, even embarrassment. For an operation designed to demonstrate absolute royal authority, this was an unexpected humiliation. The scale of the disappearance matters. The Templars were not casual sailors. They maintained a fleet sufficient to move men, horses, and treasure across long distances. These were not fishing boats that could slip away unnoticed. They required provisioning, coordination, and experienced crews. To vanish entirely meant planning, discipline, and time, which raises the most troubling question of all. When did they leave? Harbor masters claimed ignorance. Some insisted the ships had departed weeks earlier on routine business. Others suggested they had sailed under cover of night, using tides known only to seasoned mariners. A few whispered that certain officials had been paid to look away. None of these explanations satisfied the crown. If the ships had departed weeks before the arrests, it meant the Templars had known the danger was coming. If they had left only days before, it meant the secrecy of Philip's plan had been compromised at the highest level. Either scenario suggested a failure of control. La Rochelle's geography only deepened the mystery. Unlike Mediterranean ports hemmed in by competing powers, La Rochelle opened directly onto the Atlantic. From there, a ship could sail north toward the English Channel, south toward Iberia, or west into waters rarely traveled by medieval Europeans. Once beyond the coastline, tracking became nearly impossible. There were no reliable logs of transatlantic movement, no centralized maritime authority. The ocean was a vast blank page. For the Templars, this was freedom. Witness accounts from nearby villages mention unusual activity in the weeks before October 1307. Wagons moving at night, increased shipments of supplies, ships being repaired and refitted beyond what routine maintenance required. None of this seemed suspicious at the time. The Templars were known for preparedness. Only in retrospect did these details align into a pattern. The fleet had not fled in panic. It had departed calmly, deliberately, as if following instructions issued long in advance. Each ship would have known its destination. Each crew would have understood the importance of silence. And silence held. No sailor later came forward claiming to have served on those vessels. No port recorded their arrival under Templar banners. No wreckage bearing the order's markings washed ashore. The disappearance was complete. Speculation rushed in to fill the void. Some argued the ships sailed north, seeking refuge in England or Scotland. At the time, Scotland was excommunicated, beyond the Pope's authority, and hostile to England. It was a land accustomed to rebellion, where the Templars' skills and resources might be welcomed rather than feared. Others believed the fleet turned south, toward Portugal. There, the Templars enjoyed strong ties with the crown and deep involvement in maritime affairs. Portuguese rulers had little interest in aiding Philip's purge. Ships arriving quietly under trusted colors could disappear into new identities. Then there were the more radical theories that the fleet sailed west. Medieval maps often ended in speculation beyond the Atlantic, but sailors knew more than cartographers admitted. Fishing fleets had long ventured far from shore. Currents like the Canary Current and trade winds offered predictable routes. The idea that skilled mariners could cross open ocean was not impossible, just unrecorded. To suggest the Templars might have reached lands unknown to official history is controversial, but the absence of evidence cuts both ways. There is no proof they did not. What makes La Rochelle so haunting is not what is known, but what cannot be accounted for. The Order had the ships, it had the sailors, it had the motive, and at the critical moment it had the opportunity. Kings could command roads and fortresses. They could not command the sea. Royal frustration grew. Philip ordered investigations along the coast. He questioned merchants, fishermen, monks, anyone who might have seen something. Rewards were offered. Threats were issued. The silence remained unbroken. This silence suggests something deeper than fear. It suggests loyalty. The Templars' crews were not temporary hires. They were part of the Order's extended body, men who benefited from its protection and stability. To betray the secret of the fleet's destination would have endangered not only themselves, but whatever or whoever had been entrusted to their care. And so they vanished into anonymity, blending into other ports, other ships, other lives. Over time, La Rochelle resumed its rhythm. Trade continued. The tide came and went. New ships docked where Templar vessels once lay. But the memory lingered, preserved in legal documents and unanswered royal correspondence. Even centuries later, historians return to this port, drawn by its quiet defiance of explanation. Because the disappearance at La Rochelle was not an accident. It was an act of foresight, of discipline, of collective will. In a moment when the Order faced annihilation, it chose movement over resistance, secrecy over confrontation. It chose the sea. This choice reframes the fall of the Templars. Rather than a helpless victim crushed by royal power, the Order appears as a strategist, sacrificing its visible body to preserve something less tangible but more enduring. Wealth, knowledge, identity, whatever the fleet carried, it was deemed worth the cost. The harbor of La Rochelle stands as a monument not to defeat, but to disappearance. Stone walls cannot tell where ships sailed. Water does not record names. The Atlantic absorbs confessions without leaving transcripts. For a medieval king obsessed with documentation and control, this was the ultimate insult. History prefers battles with winners and losers, villains and martyrs. La Rochelle offers none of that. It offers only an empty horizon and the unsettling realization that sometimes the most powerful move is to leave no trace at all. And from that emptiness, a mystery was born. One that no court, no fire, and no decree could ever fully extinguish. Secrets rarely travel loudly. They move in fragments, in glances held a moment too long, in words spoken just out of earshot. For an Order built on discipline and silence, warning did not need to be shouted. It only needed to be understood. The question that haunts the fall of the Templars is not only where they went, but how they knew to leave. King Philip's plan had been designed to prevent exactly that. The orders were sealed, the arrests synchronized. Even high-ranking officials were kept ignorant until the final hours. And yet, the evidence suggests that at least part of the Order anticipated the blow. Ships were ready, treasures were moved, records vanished. This level of preparation does not happen overnight. Somewhere information leaked. It may have come from the Church. Pope Clement V, though publicly hesitant, was deeply entangled in French politics. He corresponded regularly with Philip. He knew of the king's concerns, if not the full scope of his intentions. It is possible that a hint, a warning couched in spiritual language, reached sympathetic ears within the Order. But that explanation feels incomplete. The Templars did not rely on single points of contact. Their strength lay in networks, and networks do not depend on one source. Over generations, The order had developed systems of internal communication refined by war and distance. Messages crossed continents without relying on official channels. Symbols carved into stone, patterns in documents, changes in routine, these were signals understood by those trained to notice them. A delay in a shipment, a request for inventory where none had been required before, a sudden tightening of royal oversight. These were not random events. To an institution attuned to political pressure, they were warnings. The Templars had learned, long before 1307, that danger announced itself indirectly. Their commanderies functioned as nodes in a web. Each maintained contact with others through trusted messengers and coded correspondence. Letters often used phrasing that appeared mundane to outsiders but carried layered meanings for those initiated into the order's habits. A reference to weather might signal political climate. A change in prayer requests might indicate urgency. Even silence could be a message. When communication from certain quarters slowed or stopped, it suggested interference. When familiar allies grew cautious, it hinted at shifting loyalties. These subtle shifts, multiplied across regions, could reveal a pattern invisible to any single observer. At the center of this web were senior commanders, men who had survived decades of crusade, diplomacy, and betrayal. They had watched kingdoms rise and fall. They understood that protection from Rome was not absolute. They had seen how quickly faith could be weaponized. When suspicion reached a certain threshold, they would not have waited for confirmation. They would have acted. Action, however, required coordination. Moving assets quietly demanded trust and precision. Not every member of the order could be told. Panic would have been disastrous. Instead, information was compartmentalized. Only those who needed to know were informed. Orders were framed as routine tasks: ship maintenance, document consolidation, asset redistribution. Nothing overt, nothing traceable. The movement of treasure likely began under the guise of standard financial operations. The Templars moved money constantly. No single transfer would have raised alarms. Records were centralized, then removed. Sensitive documents were copied, summarized, or memorized before originals disappeared. What could not be moved was destroyed. Fire became a tool of silence. Several commanderies show signs of controlled burning prior to the arrests, not widespread destruction, but selective erasure. Documents that would later be missed were not taken in panic. They were chosen. This suggests something else: time. The order was not reacting to an immediate threat. It was responding to a growing certainty. That certainty may have crystallized weeks or even months before the arrests, giving leaders the space to plan carefully. And yet, even this does not fully explain the speed with which the escape unfolded. To prepare ships, crews, routes, and destinations requires authority. Someone had to decide what was saved and what was abandoned. Someone had to choose silence over solidarity, movement over martyrdom. That choice implies hierarchy. While the Templars preached equality among brothers, the reality was more complex. Strategic decisions flowed from the top. The Grand Master and his inner circle bore responsibility not just for individual lives, but for the survival of the Order's legacy. It is possible, uncomfortable as the thought may be, that they made a grim calculation. Some would be sacrificed. Those stationed far from ports, those deeply embedded in European commanderies, those whose capture would lend credibility to the king's narrative. These men were left in place. Their arrest would buy time. Their suffering would distract attention. Their silence under interrogation would protect what had already moved beyond reach. This interpretation casts the escape in a darker light, transforming it from a noble flight into a morally complex act of triage. Survival demanded cruelty, even toward one's own. History offers no record of such deliberations, but absence speaks. No mass attempt was made to flee by land. No widespread resistance erupted. The men who could have escaped did not, suggesting either ignorance or obedience. They trusted their leaders. They believed the order would endure. Meanwhile, those entrusted with movement vanished efficiently. Warnings, once given, would have spread through specific channels, likely oral, likely symbolic. A bell rung at an unusual hour. a change in liturgy, a request to prepare for winter regardless of season. These cues, meaningless to outsiders, would have triggered rehearsed responses. The Templars trained for contingency. Crusade taught them that defeat could come suddenly. Castles fell overnight. Allies turned without notice. Survival depended on preparation for loss. By the time Philip's orders were opened, the decisive moves had already been made. The genius of this system lay in its deniability. No single warning could be traced. No messenger could be identified as the source. Even under torture, captured Templars could truthfully claim ignorance. They had not been told. They had not known. Truth and secrecy aligned. This alignment frustrated investigators. Interrogators expected fear to produce information, but found only confusion. Some prisoners seemed genuinely shocked by the disappearance of assets. Others offered guesses no better than the crown's own. The system had worked too well. In the end, the king could destroy bodies but not networks. He could burn men, but not patterns of communication embedded over generations. He could seize land, but not the knowledge of how to vanish. What emerged from the wreckage of the trials was not a clear explanation, but a chilling possibility. The Templars had not merely been warned. They had been watching. They had read the signs long before orders were written. They had sensed the tightening grip of authority, the narrowing space for independence. When the final signal came, however subtle, it confirmed what they already knew. The world had turned against them, and so they responded in the way they knew best. Quietly, collectively, and with an understanding of time that extended beyond any single lifetime. What was preserved was not an institution, but an idea, one that could survive without banners or fortresses. Messages carried in silence endure longer than those shouted from thrones. And somewhere, carried across water or buried in memory, those messages continued their journey, untouched by fire, unanswered by courts, waiting for a future that might finally be ready to hear them. As dawn crept across Europe on the morning of the arrests, not every Templar awoke to the sound of fists pounding on doors. In scattered commanderies far from royal centers, the night passed differently. There were no torches cutting through fog, no shouted orders, no chains rattling in courtyards. Instead, there was quiet movement, measured, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Lamps were lit behind shuttered windows. Brothers gathered not in panic, but in purpose. These places would later be described in fragments and rumors, glimpsed only through absence. When royal agents eventually arrived, they found rooms stripped bare of anything that mattered. The impression was not of flight, but of completion. Templar commanderies were designed for endurance. Thick stone walls, vaulted chambers, and hidden storage spaces reflected a mindset shaped by siege and survival. Many contained rooms that did not appear on official plans, crypts, cellars, passages known only to senior members. These spaces had once stored grain, weapons, and relics. Now they served a final function. Records disappeared first. Account books, correspondence, charters, and coded ledgers were gathered and removed or destroyed. These documents represented the nervous system of the order, detailing financial flows, obligations, and contacts across Europe. To leave them behind would have been catastrophic. They would have revealed not only wealth but relationships, who had donated, who had borrowed, who had relied on Templar discretion. Some records were likely burned, their ash scattered beyond recovery. Others were sealed and transported, their destinations unknown. In either case, the effect was the same. Investigators were left with fragments, unable to reconstruct the whole. Then came the vaults. Contrary to legend, most Templar houses did not contain vast hoards of gold. Wealth was rarely centralized. But what existed, coins, silver plate, sacred objects, was carefully inventoried and assessed. Decisions were made about what could be moved and what must be abandoned. Weight mattered. Time mattered. What could not travel was hidden. Stories persist of chests lowered into wells, of chambers sealed behind fresh masonry, of objects concealed beneath altars or within walls. Some of these tales are likely exaggerations, born of centuries of treasure hunting. Yet the consistency of such accounts across regions suggests a kernel of truth. The Templars were masters of concealment long before they became fugitives. And yet, even this material erasure was secondary to something more profound. Knowledge had to be secured. The Order's strength lay not in gold, but in memory. Rituals, symbols, and procedures were transmitted orally, reinforced through repetition. Senior members carried within them a map of the Order's inner workings that no document could fully capture. To preserve this knowledge, certain men had to escape. That meant making choices. In some commanderies, senior knights departed days or weeks before the arrests, leaving trusted subordinates behind. These departures were framed as routine assignments or inspections. There was no farewell, no explanation. Those left behind believed they would see their leaders again. They would not. The final nights before the crackdown were marked by a strange stillness. Fires were kept low. Bells were silent. Prayers were said with unusual intensity. Some brothers sensed that something was ending, though they could not name it. Others went about their duties, unaware that history had already moved past them. In places near the coast, movement was more urgent. Caravans left under cover of darkness, carrying sealed chests to waiting ships. The logistics of such operations would have been formidable. Routes had to avoid scrutiny. Guards had to be trusted. Timing had to align with tides and weather. Mistakes could not be afforded. Yet there is no evidence of chaos. This absence of chaos is telling. It implies rehearsal or at least preparation. The Templars had long operated under the assumption that they might one day be targeted. Contingency plans were not paranoia. They were prudence. What remains most haunting is the calm. Accounts from later interrogations mention brothers who seemed resigned rather than terrified. Some spoke of obedience to orders they did not fully understand. Others refused to speak at all, not out of defiance, but out of a sense that words no longer mattered. The Order was already elsewhere. This calm extended even to destruction. Fires lit to consume documents were controlled, not frantic. Walls were sealed with care, mortar smoothed as if for permanence. The goal was not to erase the past in anger, but to close a chapter with intention. In some commanderies, evidence suggests that sacred objects were removed last, carried by senior knights themselves. These items, relics, ceremonial tools, perhaps objects whose significance has been lost to time, were treated with reverence. They were not loot, they were legacy. The men who carried them did so knowing they might never return. When royal officials eventually arrived, the contrast was stark. They expected to find signs of resistance or flight. Instead, they found emptiness. Rooms swept clean, doors unlocked, walls silent. In some cases, even the dogs were gone. It was as if the commanderies had exhaled and emptied themselves. This emptiness bred speculation. Had the Templars destroyed everything to spite the king? Had they hidden treasure for future retrieval? Or had they simply accepted that their physical presence was no longer necessary? Perhaps all three. The destruction of records also ensured something else: plausible ignorance. Those arrested could not betray what they did not know. Those who remained free could operate without fear of exposure. The Order fractured, but in fracturing it protected its core. This strategy reflects a deep understanding of power. Institutions do not survive by clinging to form. They survive by adapting essence. The Templars may have understood that their name, their uniforms, their public role were liabilities. What mattered was the continuity of purpose, however redefined. So they let the visible structure burn. In doing so, they left behind a shell for the king to destroy. Trials could proceed. Confessions could be extracted. Executions could satisfy public appetite for justice. But the heart of the Order, its knowledge, its connections, its ability to move, had already been removed. The final nights of the commanderies were not acts of despair. They were acts of transition, a deliberate shedding of skin. And as the smoke from burned papers drifted into the night, it carried with it more than ash. It carried the last trace of an order that refused to die on someone else's terms, choosing instead to vanish, leaving behind only questions and the unsettling sense that something essential had slipped quietly into the dark, beyond the reach of kings. What haunted the aftermath of the arrests was not what had been found, but what had not. Royal inventories, preserved in fragments, reveal a pattern of disappointment. Officials opened vaults expecting abundance and encountered scarcity. They catalogued silver cups, modest sums of coin, a few reliquaries, objects worthy of seizure, yet painfully ordinary. This was not the legendary wealth whispered about for generations. This was not the treasure that could erase a kingdom's debt. The gap between expectation and reality widened with each inspection. The Templars had been accused of hoarding unimaginable riches, of bleeding Europe dry while pretending to live in poverty. The trials had been fueled by this belief. Yet when the doors were forced and the chests pried open, the myth collapsed into absence. Something vast had existed, and now it was gone. This absence became the true crime, because wealth does not vanish without leaving a shadow. It leaves missing records, disrupted flows, unanswered obligations. And in the case of the Templars, these shadows stretched across continents. Among the most glaring losses were the account books. These ledgers tracked deposits, loans, and transfers across the order's network. They were not merely financial tools. They were instruments of trust. Nobles who had entrusted their fortunes to the Templars expected accountability. Merchants relied on these records to settle disputes. Even the crown depended on them to track its own obligations. Without the ledgers, everything unraveled. Debts could not be verified. Claims could not be proven. Obligations dissolved into ambiguity. For some, this was a relief. For others, it was ruin. Lawsuits emerged, but courts found themselves helpless without documentation. The collapse of the Templars' financial infrastructure rippled outward, destabilizing local economies in subtle but profound ways. Then there were the contracts. The Templars had brokered agreements between parties who did not trust one another, lords, cities, even rival kingdoms. These agreements were often sealed with Templar mediation, their neutrality lending legitimacy. Copies were kept in multiple locations, but the most authoritative versions were centralized. Those versions disappeared. What remained were fragments and memories, insufficient to enforce anything. Disputes that had been dormant for years resurfaced. Alliances weakened. The Order's role as a stabilizing force became evident only in its absence. But beyond finances, something more enigmatic was missing. The Templars had spent decades in the East, operating in a cultural crossroads where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish traditions intersected. They encountered texts, philosophies, and practices unfamiliar to Western Europe. Some of this knowledge was practical medicine, engineering, navigation. Other parts were more abstract, touching on theology, symbolism, and cosmology. What they learned, they did not always share openly. Libraries associated with the Order were curiously sparse after the arrests. Manuscripts rumored to exist were nowhere to be found. References in correspondence pointed to texts that had vanished entirely. Scholars later noted gaps in collections where Templar influence had once been strong. It is impossible to say precisely what was lost, but the silence is suggestive. Maps, too, were conspicuously absent. The Templars had been prolific travelers, maintaining routes that connected distant regions. Their familiarity with coastlines, ports, and sea lanes exceeded that of most contemporary institutions. Navigation was not merely a skill. It was a necessity. Yet few Templar charts survived the purge. Those that did were generic, offering nothing beyond what was already known. The more detailed knowledge, currents, hidden harbors, seasonal winds, appears to have been preserved orally or removed entirely. This suggests an understanding that certain information was too valuable to risk falling into hostile hands. Then there were the relics. The medieval world believed deeply in the power of sacred objects. Relics were not symbolic. They were conduits of divine presence. Kings fought wars to possess them. Churches rose around them. The Templars were rumored to guard some of the most significant relics in Christendom, entrusted to them because of their reputation for discipline and secrecy. Officially, little was found. Some reliquaries were seized, but they were unremarkable. The great prizes, if they ever existed, were absent. Whether these relics were real or legendary matters less than the belief that they were missing. Belief shapes behavior, and the belief that something sacred had slipped beyond control fed centuries of speculation. Even more troubling to the crown was the disappearance of correspondence. Letters between the order and powerful figures, kings, popes, nobles, were expected to surface. Such documents could have been used as leverage, proof of complicity, or justification for further seizures. Instead, they were gone. This disappearance protected not only the Templars, but their former allies. It ensured that no one could be fully implicated. The web of relationships dissolved into rumor. In erasing themselves, the Templars erased others as well. This may have been intentional. By removing the evidence of interdependence, the order prevented its destruction from expanding outward. Kings who had borrowed, popes who had protected, nobles who had benefited, all were spared scrutiny. In return, they had little incentive to press too hard for answers. Silence became mutually convenient. Yet the most intriguing absence was not material at all. It was cohesion. The Templars vanished as a unified body. They did not reappear elsewhere under the same name, claiming continuity. There was no exiled headquarters, no public claim of survival. Whatever remained of the order dissolved into smaller, less visible forms. This fragmentation suggests that survival, not dominance, was the goal. The idea that the Templars carried away a single, monumental treasure is seductive, but simplistic. What they truly removed was the capacity for reconstruction. Without records, without centralized leadership, without visible assets, the order could not be resurrected in the same form, even by its enemies. This was a final act of control. By deciding what would be lost, the Templars shaped how they would be remembered. They denied their destroyers the satisfaction of total victory. The crown could burn men and seize land, but it could not claim mastery over the order's legacy. History was left with holes. These holes invite imagination. They tempt us to fill them with gold and grails, with hidden maps and lost continents. But perhaps the most radical interpretation is the simplest. The Templars ensured that what mattered most would never be found. Not because it was buried in the earth, but because it had already moved beyond the reach of anyone who sought to own it. What remained was absence, and absence has a strange power. It forces questions. It resists closure. It keeps the past alive not as a settled story, but as an unresolved tension. In that tension, the Templars endure, not as knights in white cloaks, but as a reminder that some histories are defined not by what they leave behind, but by what they take with them when they go. North of the English border lay a land already accustomed to defiance. In the early 14th century, Scotland was a kingdom at war with itself and with its neighbors. It was excommunicated from the church, locked in rebellion against English domination, and ruled by a king whom Rome refused to recognize. To the medieval mind, Scotland stood outside the normal order of Christendom, a dangerous place but also a free one. For men fleeing the reach of both king and pope, it was a natural refuge. The theory that Templars escaped to Scotland did not emerge from fantasy alone. It grew from circumstance. When the arrests swept across Europe, Scotland did not participate. King Robert the Bruce, having killed his rival before the altar of a church, lived under papal excommunication. Papal commands carried little weight in his realm. If the Templars sought sanctuary beyond Rome's reach, Scotland offered it. Geography reinforced this possibility. Templar ships leaving the Atlantic coast of France could sail north with relative ease, following familiar trade routes. The waters between France, England, and Scotland were busy, crowded with merchant vessels and fishing fleets. A handful of ships could blend in, change colors, alter flags, and disappear into the traffic. Once in Scottish waters, the political climate worked in their favor. Robert the Bruce was desperate for allies. His claim to the throne was contested, his resources limited. He needed trained fighters, experienced commanders, and access to wealth. The Templars, if they arrived, would have brought all three. This convergence of needs has fueled centuries of speculation. One of the most persistent legends places Templar knights at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Bruce's forces achieved a stunning victory over the English. Chroniclers mention a sudden, disciplined cavalry charge that turned the tide of battle. Some later writers identified these riders as Templars, fighting under no banner, bound by no allegiance except perhaps gratitude and survival. There is no contemporary proof of this, but the story endures because it fits a pattern. The Templars were renowned for shock tactics, for appearing at decisive moments. They were also men without a homeland, stripped of identity, seeking purpose. A secret alliance with Bruce would have offered both. Beyond battle, Scotland offered something more enduring: assimilation. The Templars, if they survived, could not remain visibly Templar. The name was poisoned, the habit condemned. Survival required transformation. In Scotland, with its fragmented clan system and remote landscapes, anonymity was easier to achieve. Former knights could become landholders, advisors, or monks under different orders. Some may have merged with existing groups. Scotland had its own military religious traditions, its own brotherhoods and chivalric ideals. Absorbing experienced warriors would not have been unprecedented. Over time, their origins would blur, preserved only in symbols and stories. This brings us to Rosslyn Chapel. Built in the mid-15th century by the Sinclair family, Rosslyn is a monument to mystery. Its stonework is dense with symbolism, intricate carvings that blend Christian imagery with patterns that seem out of place in medieval Europe. Among these carvings are figures some interpret as corn and aloe, plants unknown in Scotland at the time. Others see Masonic symbols centuries before Freemasonry's documented rise. The Sinclair family had deep connections to both Scotland's nobility and, according to some traditions, the Templars. While Rosslyn was built long after the order's suppression, it has become a focal point for the idea that Templar knowledge survived in Scotland, passed down through select families. Stone, unlike paper, is difficult to erase. If one wished to preserve ideas discreetly, embedding them in architecture would be an elegant solution. Again, proof is elusive, but absence does not negate possibility. It merely shifts the burden of interpretation. Scotland's isolation during this period also meant fewer records. What was not written cannot be seized. What was remembered only orally could change, adapt, survive. This environment favored the quiet endurance of ideas rather than institutions. Templars who reached Scotland may have found something unexpected: freedom from crusade. For 2 centuries, their identity had been defined by holy war. In Scotland, the conflict was political, not theological. Loyalty was owed to a king, not a pope. Fighting was for land and sovereignty, not relics and Jerusalem. This shift would have required a redefinition of purpose. Some may have welcomed it. The idea that the Templars did not disappear, but simply stopped being Templars, is compelling. It reframes survival not as escape, but as evolution. What was preserved was not an order, but a tradition of discipline, mutual loyalty, and strategic thinking. Traces of this tradition may linger in unexpected places. Scottish clan symbols, mottos, and rituals sometimes echo themes associated with the Templars: secrecy, brotherhood, guardianship. While these similarities can be coincidental, their persistence invites reflection. The connection to Freemasonry further complicates the picture. Freemasonry emerged in Scotland earlier than in many other regions, with lodges documented in the late 16th century. Some Masonic legends claim descent from the Templars, preserving their ideals under a new guise. Whether this is symbolic lineage or historical continuity remains debated, but the geographic overlap is notable. What cannot be ignored is Scotland's role as a place where unwanted men could become invisible. Unlike centralized kingdoms, Scotland's power was dispersed. Authority flowed through kinship rather than bureaucracy. A stranger with skill and loyalty could find a place, especially in turbulent times. Names could change. Pasts could be buried. For former Templars, this anonymity would have been salvation. The absence of arrests in Scotland stands as a historical fact. The lack of records stands as an invitation to speculation. Between them lies a plausible corridor of survival, perhaps not in grand fortresses or hidden treasuries, but in quiet integration. Perhaps not in open defiance, but in service rendered under new names. If so, the Templars' escape to Scotland was not an end, but a beginning of something subtler, a diffusion of influence rather than its concentration. History often seeks dramatic conclusions. Scotland offers none. Only a slow fading into landscape and lineage, into stone chapels and whispered stories, into a victory on a battlefield that changed a nation's fate. And in that fading, the possibility remains that the Templars did not vanish at sea, but stepped ashore where history was least able to follow them. Far from the battlefields of Europe, across an ocean medieval people barely understood, there exists a place that seems to defy time, logic, and patience. Oak Island is small, wind-scoured, and unremarkable at first glance. It lies off the coast of Nova Scotia, ringed by cold Atlantic waters and dense forests that press close to the shore. There are no grand ruins rising above the trees, no ancient cities half buried in sand. And yet, for more than 2 centuries, this island has refused to let go of a single unsettling question. What was hidden here and by whom? The mystery began in the late 18th century, when a group of young men noticed a strange depression in the ground beneath an old oak tree. The earth appeared deliberately disturbed. Digging revealed layers, wooden platforms placed at regular intervals, stones not native to the island, and evidence of engineering far beyond what casual settlers would attempt. As excavation continued, the mystery deepened rather than clarified. Every attempt to reach the bottom triggered flooding. Sea water poured in through hidden channels, carefully constructed to protect whatever lay below. The system was sophisticated, intentional, and extraordinarily difficult to overcome even with modern technology. This was no simple pit. Over time, stories accumulated. Tools, symbols, stone markers inscribed with unreadable markings, coconut fiber foreign to the region used as filtration material. Each discovery raised the same troubling implication. Someone with advanced knowledge, resources, and time had been here long before recorded settlement. And inevitably, the Knights Templar entered the conversation. The idea that medieval Europeans could have crossed the Atlantic before Columbus is controversial, but not absurd. Norse explorers had reached North America centuries earlier. Fishing fleets from Europe may have traveled farther west than official records admit. The ocean, once feared, was also quietly navigated by those who depended on it. The Templars, with their ships, their secrecy, and their sudden disappearance, fit the profile of candidates capable of such a journey. They possessed the means, they possessed the motivation, and, crucially, they possessed something to hide. If the order sought a place beyond the reach of kings and popes, the New World, unknown, unclaimed, unregulated, would have been the ultimate refuge. Not a land to conquer, but a vault to secure what could not be protected in Europe. The engineering of Oak Island supports this possibility in unsettling ways. The flood tunnels suggest a defensive mindset. They are not designed for habitation but for denial, preventing access rather than enabling use. Whoever built them expected intrusion. They planned for it. They invested enormous effort to ensure that even centuries later, the site would resist discovery. This aligns with a mindset shaped by persecution. A group fleeing annihilation would not build a monument. They would build a trap. Skeptics argue that the Oak Island structures could be the work of later treasure hunters, or an elaborate natural formation misunderstood by eager imaginations. These explanations account for some features but not all. The precision of the layers, the foreign materials, the consistency of the design. Each demands intentional planning, and planning implies purpose. What purpose could justify such labor? Gold is the obvious answer. Treasure has driven men to madness across history. But gold alone feels insufficient. Precious metal can be melted, divided, moved again. It does not require elaborate underwater defenses. It does not justify secrecy spanning generations. Something else may have been involved. Documents, knowledge, symbols, objects whose value lay not in weight, but in meaning. The Templars were accused, falsely or not, of possessing dangerous ideas. They were said to have learned secrets in the East, to have questioned orthodox doctrine, to have encountered beliefs that complicated simple faith. Whether these accusations were propaganda or misunderstanding, they reveal a fear, that the order knew things others did not. If such knowledge existed, hiding it would have been prudent. Oak Island, isolated and defensible, would have offered a solution. A place where time itself became a barrier. A place where discovery would require obsession, not accident. There is also the matter of symbolism. Some researchers point to geometric alignments on the island that resemble patterns found in medieval sacred architecture. Others note that the engineering reflects principles used in Templar fortifications: layered defenses, misdirection, controlled access. These parallels are circumstantial, but they are persistent. And persistence matters. The Oak Island mystery has survived not because of one piece of evidence, but because of accumulation. Each generation uncovers something that should not be there. Each attempt to dismiss the site as coincidence encounters another anomaly. If the Templars were involved, Oak Island may represent not a colony, but a final act of stewardship. They did not seek to rule the new world. They sought to remove something from the old. This interpretation reframes the journey not as exploration, but as retreat. Not ambition, but preservation. Such a voyage would have been perilous. Medieval ships crossing the Atlantic faced storms, currents, and uncertainty. Only skilled navigators with disciplined crews could attempt it. The Templars had both. They also had something more important: willingness to disappear. Men who believe their mission transcends their own lives accept risks others will not. Critics rightly point out the lack of direct evidence linking the Templars to Oak Island. No banners. No inscriptions naming the order. No documents explicitly stating their presence. But this absence may itself be meaningful. If one wished to hide something forever, one would not sign it. The strength of the Oak Island theory lies not in proof, but in coherence. It connects disappearance with destination, capability with motive. It offers a place where the missing could have gone without leaving a trail. Whether or not the Templars ever set foot on that island, Oak Island functions as a mirror to the larger mystery. It represents the possibility that history is incomplete, not because it was lost, but because it was intentionally obscured. The island keeps its secrets with stubborn patience. It floods tunnels, collapses shafts. It resists certainty. Those who dig there often speak of obsession, of a sense that something is watching, waiting. Perhaps that is the legacy of whatever was hidden. Not treasure meant to be found, but a lesson meant to endure. That some things, once removed from the world, are never meant to return. While some Templars may have fled into exile or legend, others may never have fled at all. In the western edge of Europe, along the sunlit coastlines of Iberia, the fall of the Knights Templar unfolded very differently. There was no sudden wave of mass arrests, no fires consuming Grand Masters, no desperate scramble to erase an order from memory. Instead, something quieter happened, something far more enduring. In Portugal, the Templars did not vanish. They transformed. The relationship between the Portuguese crown and the Templars had always been unusually close. From the earliest days of the Reconquista, when Christian kingdoms pushed south against Muslim rule, the Templars were not just allies, they were essential. They defended borders, built castles, and stabilized regions too dangerous for royal administration. In return, they were trusted, protected, and rewarded. Portuguese kings understood something their French counterpart did not. The Templars were not a threat to sovereignty. They were a tool of survival. When news of the arrests in France reached Portugal, King Denis I faced a choice. He could comply with papal pressure and dismantle the order, or he could protect an institution that had safeguarded his kingdom for generations. Denis was a pragmatic ruler. He saw through the political motivations behind the charges and recognized the value of the men under suspicion. Rather than destroy them, he offered a solution. In 1319, with papal approval carefully negotiated, the Order of Christ was founded. On paper, it was a new institution. In reality, it was the Templars reborn under a different name. Their properties were transferred intact. Their members were absorbed rather than imprisoned. Their mission was redefined, not erased. This was not an escape. It was survival through legitimacy. The Order of Christ inherited more than land and castles. It inherited knowledge, discipline, and maritime expertise refined over centuries. Unlike their counterparts elsewhere in Europe, Portuguese Templars did not need to hide. They continued their work openly, now aligned with royal ambition rather than papal crusade. The implications of this continuity are profound. If the Templars had truly been guilty of the charges leveled against them, Portugal's actions would have been reckless, even heretical. Yet the Pope approved the transition. This suggests that, beneath the public spectacle, the accusations were understood to be politically motivated rather than spiritually grounded. Truth survived where power was balanced. The Order of Christ soon became inseparable from Portugal's destiny. Its cross, distinct yet reminiscent of the Templar emblem, adorned ships, banners, and fortresses. It became a symbol not of crusade, but of exploration. This shift mattered. As Europe emerged from the medieval period, attention turned from holy war to discovery. Trade routes expanded. Curiosity grew. The sea, once a barrier, became a pathway. Portugal stood at the forefront of this transformation, and at its heart stood an order descended directly from the Templars. Prince Henry the Navigator, one of the central figures of the Age of Discovery, was Grand Master of the Order of Christ. Under his patronage, Portuguese ships pushed farther down the African coast than any before them. They mapped currents, studied winds, and refined navigation techniques that would eventually carry Europeans across oceans. This was not coincidence. The Templars had long understood the strategic value of maritime power. Their ships had moved armies and treasure when roads failed. That knowledge did not disappear with the order's suppression. In Portugal, it found new expression. Some historians argue that the Age of Discovery was fueled not just by innovation, but by inheritance. The methods used by Portuguese explorers, systematic mapping, staged voyages, careful documentation, reflect an institutional memory. This was exploration not as adventure, but as process. Exactly the kind of thinking a disciplined military order would foster. If so, then the Templars did not lose their future. They reshaped it. This raises an unsettling possibility. If part of the order survived openly in Portugal, could another part have survived secretly elsewhere? Could the fleet that vanished from La Rochelle have sailed not into oblivion, but toward a kingdom willing to shelter them? Portugal's Atlantic ports, like Lisbon and Porto, were ideally positioned to receive ships quietly. A vessel arriving under altered colors would not attract attention. Crews could be absorbed into an existing maritime culture. Assets could be redistributed without spectacle. This scenario bridges legend and reality. It allows for the survival of both wealth and knowledge without requiring fantastical journeys to unknown continents. It explains how Templar expertise could influence global exploration without leaving obvious traces of flight. More importantly, it suggests intentional division. One branch of the order accepted visibility, legitimacy, and service to a crown. Another may have chosen secrecy, autonomy, and disappearance. Both choices reflect the same instinct: adapt or die. Portugal offered a model for how adaptation could work. The Order of Christ did not cling to Crusader ideals long after they had lost relevance. It reoriented toward the future. Its members became explorers, administrators, and patrons of science. They did not fight for Jerusalem. They mapped the world. In doing so, they carried forward something essential from the Templar ethos: the belief that purpose transcends form. Names change, symbols evolve, missions shift, but institutions survive when they are willing to become something new. This continuity also reframes the moral narrative of the Templars. Rather than victims crushed by tyranny or conspirators fleeing justice, they emerge as pragmatists navigating political reality. In France, they were sacrificed to royal ambition. In Portugal, they were preserved because they were useful and trusted. History, it seems, is kinder to those who align with power rather than oppose it. And yet, the Portuguese survival is not merely a footnote. It is a challenge to the idea that the Templars truly fell. An order that can change its name and continue shaping global events has not been destroyed, it has evolved. The ships bearing the cross of the Order of Christ would soon sail beyond known horizons, carrying Europe into a new age. Their sails caught the same winds once used by Templar fleets. Their crews relied on knowledge refined long before. If the Templars' ships disappeared, perhaps some did so in plain sight. Perhaps they did not sink or vanish into myth, but re-emerged under a different banner, steering history itself into uncharted waters, proving that disappearance does not always mean loss, and survival does not always require secrecy. Sometimes, the most effective escape is to change your name and keep going. High above the Atlantic coast of Portugal, where mist drifts through hills thick with oak and stone, there is a place that feels deliberately unreal. Sintra rises like a memory rather than a town. Its palaces cling to cliffs. Its forests swallow sound. Paths curve where straight roads would be easier, and towers appear where no military logic demands them. For centuries, visitors have sensed that Sintra was not built merely to be lived in, but to be experienced, to be entered slowly, layer by layer. Long before it became a romantic retreat for poets and kings, Sintra was something else entirely. It was a threshold. When the Knights Templar found refuge in Portugal and quietly transformed into the Order of Christ, they did not simply preserve lands and ships. They preserved symbols, ways of thinking, methods of teaching that did not rely on books or proclamations, but on movement, architecture, and ritual. Sintra became one of the places where that preservation took physical form. At the heart of this mystery lies a structure that has unsettled scholars and visitors alike. The initiation well at the Quinta de Regalera. It is not a well in the traditional sense. It does not draw water. Instead, it descends deep into the earth, a spiraling stone shaft lined with arches, landings, and symbols. From above, it looks like a tower turned inside out. From below, it feels like a deliberate descent away from the world of light. There is no practical reason for it to exist. And yet, every element appears intentional. The number of steps matters. The direction of the spiral matters. The placement of landings matters. At the bottom, tunnels branch outward, leading to other hidden spaces, gardens, and chambers. It is not a trap. It is not a prison. It is a journey. Those who believe the site is linked to Templar tradition point to these features as echoes of initiation rituals, symbolic deaths and rebirths, passages from ignorance to understanding. Similar ideas appear across medieval mystical traditions, but Sintra's execution is unusually precise. The descent strips away the outside world. As one moves downward, sound fades. Temperature shifts. The sky disappears. What remains is stone, breath, and deliberate motion. It is impossible not to feel that one is being guided, even when walking alone. This is how knowledge was transmitted when writing was dangerous. The Templars had learned, through bitter experience, that documents could be seized, misread, or destroyed. Symbols carved in stone were safer. Experiences embedded in space were safer still. You could not confiscate what could not be written down. Architecture became memory. Sintra structures do not declare their meaning openly. They suggest. They invite interpretation. A cross that is not quite a cross. A path that doubles back on itself. A doorway too small to pass through easily. Each feature slows the visitor, forcing attention. This was education through disorientation. Those initiated would not be told what to think. They would be shown where to walk, when to descend, when to pause. Meaning emerged through participation, not instruction. Such methods leave no transcripts, only impressions carried forward by those who experienced them. This is why Sintra matters. If the Templars or their Portuguese successors wished to preserve inner teachings without risking exposure, places like this offered a solution. Knowledge could be passed selectively, embedded in ritual spaces accessible only to the initiated or the trusted. And Sintra was ideally suited for this role. Protected by terrain, favored by the crown, removed from the scrutiny of major cities. It sat at the intersection of royal power and natural isolation. Kings visited, but they did not linger. Mystics lingered, but did not rule. The landscape itself encouraged secrecy. Forests hid movement. Hills disrupted sightlines. Fog blurred distances. Even today, Sintra resists clear navigation. Paths feel older than maps, as if they were designed to be learned through walking rather than reading. For a tradition rooted in symbolism, this environment was perfect. Some scholars argue that the symbols found at Sintra reflect influences far older than the Templars, pagan, Hermetic, even Islamic. This does not weaken the connection. It strengthens it. The Templars had spent generations in the East, encountering philosophies outside Western orthodoxy. They had learned to synthesize, to translate ideas across cultures. Sintra reflects that synthesis. Christian imagery coexists with geometric patterns associated with sacred mathematics. Water features align with solar and lunar cycles. Numbers recur with obsessive consistency. None of this is accidental, but none of it announces itself as heresy either. It is knowledge hidden in plain sight. This duality mirrors the Templars' post-suppression existence in Portugal. Outwardly loyal, inwardly continuous, serving the crown while preserving traditions that could not be openly named. The initiation well, in this sense, is not about descent alone. It is about survival. Descent as concealment, as adaptation, as a refusal to remain visible when visibility is lethal. Those who descend are not escaping the world. They are learning how to re-enter it changed. This theme appears again and again in Templar lore after 1307. The idea that truth must sometimes be buried to endure, that light is most powerful when it survives the dark. Sintra offers a counterpoint to the violence of the trials. Where Paris burned, Sintra built. Where France demanded confessions, Portugal created spaces for silence. Where power shouted, tradition whispered. There is no document that states the initiation well was used by Templars or the Order of Christ. There never would be. To write such a thing would defeat its purpose. Instead, what remains is resonance, the unsettling sense that the space knows more than it says. Visitors often describe the same feeling. A sense of being watched not by eyes but by intention. A sense that the place expects something of you. That walking its paths is not passive. That meaning arrives slowly, if at all. This is how secrets survive centuries. Not by being hidden once, but by being hidden in a way that requires effort to access. Not everyone who enters Sintra understands it. Not everyone who descends the well comes back changed. The knowledge is not forced. It waits. If the Templar ships did not vanish into nothingness, but instead dispersed knowledge into landscapes like this, then their greatest legacy was not treasure or maps, but method. A way of preserving ideas without relying on institutions. Sintra stands as quiet evidence of that method. Stone does not confess, hills do not betray, and rituals, once embedded in place, can outlast orders, kings, and even memory itself. In the end, Sintra suggests that the Templars did not merely run from destruction. They planned for continuity. They accepted that survival would require transformation, subtlety, and patience measured in generations. And in doing so, they ensured that while their name might fade, the deeper current of what they were would continue to flow, silently, steadily, through places where history learned not to look too closely. Beyond Europe's familiar shores lies a different kind of silence. It is the silence of warm water and slow horizons, of islands scattered like secrets across blue expanses, of places where history arrived late and records arrived later. The Caribbean, long before it became a theater of empire and piracy, was an in-between world, neither fully known nor entirely imagined. It is here that one of the most elusive shadows of the Templar story is said to linger. The idea that Templars, or those carrying their legacy, reached the Caribbean sounds, at first, like legend layered atop legend. Yet the further one looks into maritime history, the more the edges blur. The Atlantic was not crossed only once, nor by one people. Knowledge of currents, winds, and routes accumulated slowly, unevenly, often outside official chronicles. What official history records and what sailors know are rarely the same. By the time Columbus sailed west, Iberian mariners were already fluent in Atlantic navigation. They understood the trade winds that carried ships toward the Americas and the currents that brought them back. This knowledge did not appear suddenly. It was inherited, refined, and guarded. The Templars, and later the Order of Christ, had been part of this inheritance. If some portion of the vanished fleet sailed south from La Rochelle or slipped into Portuguese ports, it could have merged into a maritime culture that quietly knew more about the ocean than it admitted. From there, routes leading beyond the Canary Islands, beyond Cape Verde, and into the western Atlantic were not unimaginable. They were simply unpublicized. The Caribbean, with its maze of islands and natural harbors, offered everything a fugitive network might desire. Isolation without desolation, resources without oversight, places to anchor, repair, and resupply without attracting attention. Even centuries later, pirates would recognize these advantages instinctively. Piracy, in fact, complicates the story in revealing ways. Pirates did not emerge from nowhere. They were often former sailors, soldiers, or privateers, men with maritime skill and familiarity with secrecy. Some legends suggest that early pirate codes, emphasizing equality, shared wealth, and loyalty among brothers, echo older traditions. Whether this is coincidence or inheritance is impossible to prove. But the resemblance is striking. Brotherhoods bound by oath, shared spoils, strict discipline enforced by collective will. These principles mirror those of military orders far more than they mirror royal navies. It is tempting to imagine that fragments of Templar culture survived by adapting to new environments and new names. This does not require grand conspiracies. It requires only continuity. If men trained in secrecy and survival found themselves far from home, stripped of legitimacy but rich in skill, they would naturally gravitate toward communities that valued those traits. The Caribbean, during its early period of European contact, was exactly such a place. There are also more tangible hints. Stone carvings on certain Caribbean islands bear symbols that some interpret as crosses predating Spanish conquest. These claims are controversial and often exaggerated, but they persist because they tap into a larger unease. That European presence in the region may have begun earlier and more quietly than official narratives allow. Similarly, legends of hidden caches, of caves sealed by deliberate collapses, of objects buried with ritual care, surface repeatedly across the Caribbean. Most are dismissed as pirate lore. Yet pirate lore itself often repurposes older stories, grafting new identities onto older secrets. The Caribbean is not a single place. It is a constellation of hiding spots. For a group seeking to protect something, knowledge, documents, symbols, the region offered dispersion. No single location needed to hold everything. A network could be spread across islands, each piece meaningless on its own, but powerful together. This mirrors the Templars' financial strategy in Europe. Distribute, decentralize, prevent total loss. Such a system would leave few traces. Each island would offer fragments, easily dismissed or misinterpreted. Only when viewed as a whole would the pattern emerge, and even then uncertainty would remain. What would the Templars or their successors be doing in the Caribbean? Not ruling, not evangelizing, not conquering, preserving distance from authority, preserving autonomy, preserving the option to move again if discovered. The Caribbean, after all, is never still. Storms reshape coastlines. Islands shift in relevance. A harbor safe today may be exposed tomorrow. Adaptation is mandatory. This adaptability echoes a deeper theme in the Templar story. Survival through movement. Identity through function rather than name. Brotherhood through shared purpose rather than public recognition. In this light, the Caribbean becomes less a destination and more a phase. A place where the legacy could rest, fragment, and evolve until the world changed enough to make new expressions possible. Critics rightly argue that the evidence is thin. No medieval documents place Templars in the Caribbean. No confirmed artifacts bear their unmistakable mark. But this absence aligns perfectly with what we know of the Order's post-suppression strategy. Visibility was dangerous. To leave proof would have been reckless. The safest survival leaves no signature. The Caribbean also offers a symbolic resonance that is difficult to ignore. It represents the far edge of medieval imagination, a place beyond maps and certainty. To hide something there was to remove it not just geographically but conceptually. It would exist beyond the mental reach of those hunting it. Kings could not pursue what they could not imagine. If the Templars' ships did not vanish into myth, but sailed into regions that would not be named for centuries, then their disappearance was not an accident of history. It was a strategic withdrawal from history itself. In time, the Caribbean would become a stage for empires, for slavery, for piracy, for unimaginable violence. But before all that, it was simply space, open, fragmented, and ungoverned. The perfect place to wait. Perhaps nothing of the Templars remains there. Perhaps their legacy dissolved into currents and coral, leaving no recoverable trace. Or perhaps fragments still lie hidden, not as treasure chests, but as ideas embedded in stories, practices, and forgotten routes. What matters is not whether the Caribbean holds proof. What matters is that it represents possibility. A reminder that disappearance does not always mean death. Sometimes it means distance. Sometimes it means patience. And sometimes it means choosing a place so far from power that power forgets to look there at all. In that sense, the Caribbean stands not as a claim, but as a shadow, a quiet suggestion that the Templars' journey did not end at Europe's edge, but slipped onward into waters where history itself learned to lose the trail. They claim to show the world as it is, to turn uncertainty into lines and symbols, to make distance measurable and safe. But throughout history, maps have also been confessions, quiet admissions of what their makers knew and what they were willing to reveal. Among the most unsettling artifacts connected to the mystery of the Templars are maps that seem to know too much too early. Medieval cartography was constrained by myth and theology as much as by measurement. Dragons marked the edges of the known world. Coastlines blurred into speculation. And yet, scattered among these imaginative depictions are charts of astonishing precision, maps that trace shores with confidence, that suggest knowledge gained not from hearsay, but from experience. These are the Portolan charts. Emerging in the late 13th century, Portolans focus not on kingdoms or doctrine, but on navigation. They map coastlines, harbors, distances, and compass directions with a clarity unmatched by earlier maps. Their accuracy is so striking that historians still debate how such detail was achieved without modern instruments. What is often overlooked is who benefited most from such maps. Military orders, merchants, and sailors, not scholars or theologians, relied on Portolans. They were practical tools passed hand to hand, copied carefully, guarded closely. To lose one was to lose advantage. To reveal one was to empower rivals. The Templars lived in this world of guarded knowledge. Their ships crossed seas regularly. Their ports dotted the Mediterranean and Atlantic. They would have required detailed navigation information to operate efficiently and safely. Over decades, such information would accumulate into something far more valuable than any single map. A mental atlas. Unlike parchment, memory cannot be seized. When the order fell, physical maps associated with the Templars are notably scarce. This absence is suspicious in itself. One would expect a prolific maritime institution to leave behind charts. Instead, what survives is either generic or appears suddenly in other contexts. Some early maps hint at coastlines that would not officially be charted until centuries later. Outlines of landmasses west of Europe appear vague but suggestive. Southern continents are depicted with proportions that defy medieval assumptions. These anomalies are often dismissed as coincidence or artistic license. But patterns emerge when viewed collectively. Certain Portolan charts include islands or coasts labeled ambiguously, placed where later exploration would confirm land existed. Names are cryptic. Shapes are incomplete. Yet the placement is too consistent to ignore. The question arises, where did this information come from? One possibility is that it came from sailors who traveled farther than their governments acknowledged. Fishermen chasing cod across the Atlantic may have reached North American waters long before Columbus. Traders following currents may have stumbled upon islands and returned quietly, sharing knowledge only within trusted circles. The Templars would have been ideally positioned to collect and protect such knowledge. They maintained secrecy as policy. They valued utility over recognition. If they encountered lands beyond accepted geography, they would not have announced it. They would have assessed its value, then decided how and if it should be used. This interpretation aligns with the absence of explicit claims. No Templar chronicle boasts of discovering new continents. No map bears their seal proclaiming triumph. Instead, we find subtle hints embedded in documents that refuse to fully explain themselves. Maps that should not exist do not declare their origins. They whisper. Another unsettling aspect of these maps is their orientation. Many medieval maps prioritize religious symbolism, placing Jerusalem at the center. Portolan charts do not. They are oriented toward navigation, not theology. Their priorities are wind and water, not doctrine. This practical worldview mirrors the Templars' evolution. Though born of religious zeal, the order matured into an institution that valued logistics and planning as much as faith. Survival required realism. Maps stripped of myth were tools of survival. It is also worth noting how these maps were transmitted. They were often copied without attribution. A chart would be reproduced, modified, and passed on. Over time, origins blurred. Knowledge became communal, detached from its source. This process protected the original holders from scrutiny while ensuring continuity. If the Templars had access to advanced geographic knowledge, dispersing it in this way would have been prudent. Better to let fragments circulate than to hoard a complete picture. This dispersal would explain why no single map provides definitive proof. Instead, many maps offer partial glimpses. Coastlines appear, disappear, reappear. Islands shift names or vanish entirely. The truth is fragmented by design. Fragmentation is a form of concealment. Consider also the timing. The sudden improvement in cartographic accuracy coincides with the period immediately following the Templars' suppression. As if knowledge long held privately began to seep into broader circulation once the institution that guarded it was dismantled. This is not to suggest deliberate release. More likely, it was the result of diffusion. Former Templar sailors and administrators found new patrons. They carried skills and information with them. Over time, what had been secret became common practice. But common practice does not require public explanation. Thus, history records advancement without attribution. The mystery deepens when we consider how early explorers navigated so confidently into the unknown. Columbus, for example, carried charts that suggested land lay west of Europe. His calculations were flawed, yet his confidence was unwavering. He expected land. Expectation implies precedent. Whether that precedent came from Norse sagas, sailor lore, or institutional memory remains debated. But the Templars, with their Atlantic presence and vanished fleet, cannot be excluded. Maps are not neutral objects. They reflect choices about what to show and what to hide. In an age where knowledge equaled power, withholding information was as strategic as acquiring it. The Templars understood this. Their disappearance coincides not with a loss of knowledge, but with its redistribution. What had been concentrated within a disciplined order became scattered among states, merchants, and explorers. This scattering blurred origins. It also ensured survival. The idea that the Templars carried forbidden maps across the sea is dramatic, but perhaps misleading. More likely, they carried ways of seeing the world, mental frameworks that prioritized routes over realms, movement over borders. These frameworks outlived them. Today, when we examine early maps and feel a sense of unease at what they seem to know, we are confronting the limits of official history. We are seeing traces of journeys that were not meant to be recorded, of knowledge that traveled quietly, protected by those who understood its danger. The maps do not prove where the Templars went, but they suggest that someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. And sometimes, the most revealing thing a map can show is not land, but silence, drawn carefully around truths that were never meant to be spoken aloud. For all the power kings wielded, there was one authority they feared even more, the quiet judgment of the Church. The destruction of the Knights Templar is often framed as a clash between crown and order, but behind that struggle stood an institution whose silence was as decisive as any decree, the papacy. Without Rome's consent, the annihilation of a papally sanctioned order should have been impossible. And yet it happened, not loudly, not cleanly, but with a hesitation that raises questions still unanswered. Pope Clement V occupied an uneasy throne. He was the first of the Avignon popes, ruling not from Rome but from French territory, his position shadowed by the influence of King Philip IV. Clement was not a revolutionary pope, nor a zealot. He was cautious, legalistic, and deeply aware of the political minefield beneath his feet. When accusations against the Templars reached him, his initial reaction was not agreement but doubt. Heresy was a grave charge, but the evidence was thin and inconsistent. The Templars had been created by the Church, protected by it, and praised for centuries. To condemn them outright would be to admit a catastrophic failure of oversight. Clement knew this. He also knew something else. If the accusations were false, but politically useful, opposing them could fracture Christendom. Kings were growing more assertive. Papal authority, once unquestioned, was weakening. A direct confrontation with France risked schism. So Clement hesitated. That hesitation created space for Philip to act first, and for the narrative to harden before the Church could shape it. By the time Clement attempted to assert control, arrests had already taken place, confessions had been extracted, and public opinion had shifted. The Pope was reacting, not leading. This reactive posture defines the Church's role in the Templar affair. Clement issued bulls calling for investigation, not execution. He insisted that the order be judged by ecclesiastical courts, not royal ones. But these distinctions blurred in practice. French interrogators continued their work. Torture continued. Confessions multiplied. Rome watched. And this watching is what unsettles historians. Because the Church had resources. It had inquisitors, legates, theologians. If Clement truly believed the Templars innocent, he could have acted decisively. If he believed them guilty, he could have moved swiftly to suppress them. Instead, he lingered in uncertainty. Some interpret this as weakness. Others see calculation. Clement may have understood that the truth, whatever it was less important than stability. An order as powerful as the Templars could not be left in limbo. But neither could it be destroyed without consequence. Delay allowed events to unfold in a way that diffused responsibility. By the time the Council of Vienne convened in 1311 to 1312, the outcome was all but decided. The Templars were not formally declared heretical. Instead, the order was dissolved by way of provision, a legal maneuver that avoided definitive judgment. This distinction matters. The Church did not condemn the Templars for proven guilt. It dissolved them to preserve peace. In effect, Clement admitted that the truth could not be clearly established, but acted anyway. This is an extraordinary admission. It suggests that the Church knew the case was flawed, yet proceeded for political reasons. It also explains why so many questions were left unresolved. A thorough investigation might have exposed inconsistencies too dangerous to confront. So the Church chose silence. This silence extended to the missing ships. If the Templars had fled with treasure, documents, or knowledge, Rome never publicly pursued them. No papal fleet was dispatched. No universal search was ordered. The disappearance was acknowledged, but not investigated with urgency. Why? One possibility is embarrassment. To admit that a papally sanctioned order had outmaneuvered both Crown and Church would undermine authority. Better to let the matter fade into ambiguity. Another possibility is complicity. The Church had long relied on the Templars. It had benefited from their protection, their banking, their obedience. It is conceivable that some within the papal administration preferred not to know where the order's assets went, so long as they were beyond Philip's reach. Silence can be a form of protection. There is also the matter of documents. The Vatican's archives are vast, and access to them has historically been restricted. Over the centuries, researchers have noted gaps in records related to the Templars, correspondence that should exist but does not, references to reports that cannot be found. Some documents were likely lost. Others may have been deliberately set aside. The famous Chinon parchment, rediscovered centuries later, revealed that Pope Clement had secretly absolved Templar leaders of heresy even as the order was being dismantled. This single document reframed the entire narrative, proving that the Church's public stance did not reflect its private conclusions. If one such document survived unnoticed, how many others remain hidden? The Chinon parchment suggests that the Pope knew the Templars were not heretics in the doctrinal sense. If so, then the dissolution was a political sacrifice. The order was offered up to preserve a fragile balance of power. In this context, the Church's lack of interest in the vanished fleet becomes more understandable. To pursue the ships would be to reopen the case. To ask what they carried would be to ask why they needed to carry it away. And that line of questioning could lead back to Rome itself, its debts, its alliances, its dependence on an order it now disavowed. Better to let the sea keep its secrets. This does not mean the Church orchestrated the escape. It means it may have chosen not to interfere. Passive allowance can be as decisive as active support. Throughout history, institutions often survive not by controlling events, but by deciding which events not to control. The Templars' disappearance sits squarely in that category. Clement V died in 1314, shortly after the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned in Paris. With his death, any remaining chance of revisiting the Templar question vanished. Successive popes inherited a settled matter, one best left undisturbed. And so it was. The Church moved on. New orders rose. New crusades were imagined. The memory of the Templars faded into cautionary tale and whispered legend. Officially, they were gone. Unofficially, they were unresolved. The Church's unanswered questions linger like closed doors in a long corridor. We know they exist. We know something lies behind them, but we are not invited to open them. Perhaps that is intentional. Institutions, like individuals, carry secrets not because they are dramatic, but because revealing them would change how we see the past and, by extension, authority itself. If the Church knew more than it said, if it allowed the Templars to disappear rather than expose inconvenient truths, then the mystery of the vanished ships is not merely a tale of escape. It is a reflection of how power manages uncertainty, not by solving it but by containing it. And in that containment, the sea becomes an ally, wide enough to absorb guilt, deep enough to hold silence, patient enough to outlast those who might someday ask the wrong questions. On a cold evening in March of 1314, the long story of the Knights Templar appeared to reach its end. The Isle de la Cite lay wrapped in firelight and shadow. Crowds gathered along the Seine, drawn by rumor and spectacle, by the promise of finality. Executions were not unusual in medieval Paris, but this one carried a different weight. The man bound to the stake was not a common criminal or a nameless heretic. He was Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, the last public face of an order that had once stood at the center of Christendom. He had spent 7 years in prison. 7 years of interrogations, reversals, false confessions, retractions, and legal theater. 7 years watching his brothers die one by one, some under torture, others by slow neglect. By this night, the machinery of power expected compliance. A final confession would justify everything that had been done. That was the plan. As the sentence was read, de Molay was expected to confirm the guilt of the order, to seal its destruction with his own words. For years, pain had forced him to say what his captors demanded. This time something changed. Standing before the flames, Jacques de Molay withdrew his confession. He declared the charges false. He proclaimed the innocence of the Templars. He spoke not with the desperation of a broken man, but with clarity and resolve. Witnesses later wrote that his voice carried across the square, calm and unwavering. In that moment, the script collapsed. There could be no trial now, no debate. A public reversal threatened the entire narrative the Crown and Church had constructed. To hesitate would invite doubt, and doubt was dangerous. The order was given. The fire was lit. As smoke rose and flames climbed, de Molay is said to have issued a final declaration, one that would echo through centuries of legend. He called upon God to judge those who had condemned him unjustly. He summoned Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to answer before divine justice within a year. Whether these exact words were spoken or later embroidered is impossible to know. Medieval chroniclers often shaped events to fit moral frameworks. But what followed gave the story extraordinary power. Pope Clement V died just weeks later, in April of 1314, weakened by illness and political strain. King Philip IV died before the year was out, struck by a sudden stroke while hunting. His death was followed by a rapid collapse of his lineage, with his sons dying without heirs and the Capetian dynasty unraveling in what later generations would call a curse. Coincidence is a historian's refuge. And yet, the sequence unsettled contemporaries. To medieval minds, divine judgment was not abstract. It was immediate, personal, and often violent. The idea that the Templars' Grand Master had called down justice, and that justice had answered, fit the worldview of the time too perfectly to dismiss. Thus, the legend of the curse was born. But beneath the supernatural framing lies a deeper emotional truth. Jacques de Molay's death was not just an execution. It was a refusal, a final act of agency in a story defined by coercion. By retracting his confession at the last moment, he denied his enemies the moral victory they sought. They could burn his body. They could not control his meaning. This mattered more than anyone present could have realized. For years, the trials had worked to erase the Templars' legitimacy. Confessions had been used to justify confiscation, to reshape memory. De Molay's final words disrupted that process. They reintroduced uncertainty at the very end, ensuring that doubt would survive alongside official history. That doubt became fertile ground. The curse narrative transformed de Molay from a defeated prisoner into a moral victor. It shifted sympathy back toward the Templars, recasting them not as heretics, but as martyrs. The fire meant to end their story instead sealed its power. And power, once released, does not remain contained. The deaths of Clement and Philip destabilized institutions already under strain. The papacy, weakened by its move to Avignon and its dependence on French support, entered a period of diminished authority. The French monarchy faced succession crises and internal conflict. The confidence with which both had acted against the Templars dissolved into unease. It was as if the destruction of the order had broken something invisible. In the years that followed, no one rushed to reopen the Templar case. No one pushed to investigate the missing ships or treasure. The appetite for inquiry vanished. Silence, once useful, became necessary. The fire on the Seine did not cleanse the past, cauterized it. Emotionally, Jacques de Molay's execution marked a turning point. The narrative shifted from accusation to loss, from certainty to ambiguity. The Templars were no longer merely an institution destroyed by law. They became a symbol of injustice, of power abused, of faith weaponized. This symbolism endured because it spoke to something universal. The image of an old man standing calmly before flames, refusing to betray his truth, resonates across cultures and eras. It reframes the entire saga not as a failure of the Templars, but as a failure of the systems that destroyed them. And systems, unlike individuals, do not burn cleanly. The curse legend also served another purpose. It redirected attention. Instead of asking what the Templars had taken with them, people asked what vengeance they had unleashed. Instead of searching for ships, they whispered about fate. Myth replaced investigation. Perhaps this, too, was part of the legacy. Stories can guard secrets more effectively than silence. A curse is memorable, emotionally charged, and ultimately unprovable. It absorbs curiosity without satisfying it. While people debated divine judgment, practical questions faded into the background. Where did the fleet go? What was carried away? Who survived? The fire did not answer these questions. It obscured them. In the end, Jacques de Molay's death achieved something extraordinary. It transformed a political purge into a moral drama. It ensured that the Templars would not be remembered solely as victims or villains, but as a cautionary tale about power, faith, and injustice. The flames consumed his body, but they illuminated the cracks in authority that had condemned him. And as smoke drifted over the river and the crowd dispersed into the Paris night, something intangible escaped with it. Not a ship, not a treasure, but a legacy of unresolved tension. The sense that history had not ended cleanly, that something had been taken away before judgment could be rendered, and that whatever the Templars had truly been, their final act ensured they would never be reduced to silence alone. Long after the fires of Paris burned out, after the names of kings faded from memory and the order itself was declared extinct, something peculiar remained. The ideas did not die. They changed form. When institutions collapse, their structures disappear first. Titles, uniforms, public authority. What lingers is subtler. Habits of thought, symbols stripped of context, stories carried forward by those who no longer remember where they began. In the case of the Templars, this lingering presence took on a life of its own, weaving into bloodlines, brotherhoods, and quiet traditions that claimed no direct descent, yet echoed familiar patterns. The most persistent of these echoes appears in the rise of secret fraternities. Across late medieval and early modern Europe, groups emerged that emphasized brotherhood, initiation, secrecy, and moral discipline. They met behind closed doors. They communicated through symbols. They spoke of ancient wisdom preserved across ages. None openly declared themselves heirs of the Templars. They did not need to. The resemblance was enough to spark suspicion and fascination. Freemasonry, in particular, became the focal point of these speculations. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Masonic lodges spread rapidly, especially in Britain and Scotland. They presented themselves as moral societies, dedicated to self-improvement, fraternity, and symbolic teaching through ritual. On the surface, this seems far removed from crusading knights. Yet the deeper one looks, the more parallels emerge. Initiation rites involving symbolic death and rebirth. Oaths sworn in secrecy. A reverence for geometry, architecture, and sacred space. A belief that knowledge should be revealed gradually, according to readiness rather than rank. These are not uniquely Templar traits. They appear in many traditions. But their convergence in regions linked to Templar survival theories, Scotland, Portugal, parts of France, invites reflection. The Scottish connection is especially telling. Scotland, untouched by the mass arrests of 1307, became fertile ground for alternative narratives. Its political isolation, combined with its strong craft guild traditions, created space for new forms of organization. Early Masonic lodges there were not merely social clubs. They were tightly knit communities bound by trust and ritual. Some Masonic legends claim that the order's origins lie in ancient builders, or in the preservation of sacred knowledge through symbolic architecture. Others hint, quietly, at knights who found refuge after persecution, carrying their values into new forms of brotherhood. These legends are not historical proof. But legends do not arise in a vacuum. They often serve to encode memory where documentation is dangerous or impossible. A story told as myth can survive where facts cannot. Bloodlines also play a role in this persistence. Noble families associated with the Templars did not vanish when the order fell. Many retained land, influence, and connections. Some were deeply entangled with both church and crown, navigating survival through loyalty shifts rather than exile. Over generations, family traditions blurred into folklore. Symbols carved into manor houses, mottos hinting at secrecy or guardianship, heirlooms with unclear origins. These became markers of identity without explanation. To an outsider, they meant nothing. To descendants, they meant continuity. It is tempting to imagine a grand, coordinated effort to preserve Templar knowledge through bloodlines and societies. Reality is likely more fragmented. Survival rarely follows a single plan. It adapts, improvises, compromises. Some former Templars may have entered monastic orders. Others may have served as mercenaries, advisors, or administrators. A few may have married, raised families, and passed down values rather than secrets. Values are harder to destroy than institutions. The emphasis on loyalty to brothers over rulers. The belief that truth is layered, not absolute. The conviction that power must be balanced by moral restraint. These ideas resonate strongly in later fraternities that sought to operate outside the direct control of state or church. It is here that the idea of hidden continuity becomes compelling. Not a conspiracy, but a cultural inheritance. Consider how often later secret societies emphasize architecture and building, not merely as trades but as metaphors. Building the self. Building society. Building according to principles unseen by the uninitiated. The Templars were builders too. They built fortresses, ports, commanderies, structures designed for function, defense, and endurance. Their understanding of space was practical and symbolic. A fortress was not just walls. It was order imposed on chaos. This architectural mindset survives remarkably well in symbolic form. The shift from stone to symbol reflects adaptation. When building castles became impossible, building ideas became essential. There is also the matter of timing. The explosion of fraternal societies in Europe coincides with periods of upheaval, religious wars, the Reformation, the rise of centralized states. In such times, groups that valued discretion and internal loyalty thrived. They provided stability when institutions failed. This mirrors the environment in which the Templars themselves had risen centuries earlier. Their original purpose was to provide order in chaos, protection where none existed. Perhaps what survived was not the order, but the response to disorder. This perspective strips away the romance of lost treasure and replaces it with something more human: the persistence of community under pressure. Still, the allure of direct lineage remains strong. Symbols associated with the Templars, crosses, swords, seals, reappear in altered forms across Europe. Sometimes these are coincidental. Sometimes they are deliberate homage. Occasionally, they may represent continuity disguised as reinterpretation. The key is ambiguity. Ambiguity protects survival. It allows those who know to recognize one another without announcing themselves to the world. This ambiguity frustrates historians and delights storytellers. It leaves room for interpretation, for speculation, for meaning layered atop meaning. But perhaps the most important survival of all was psychological. The Templars became a cautionary myth, a reminder of what happens when power becomes too centralized, too independent, too threatening to authority. Their destruction taught future groups how to endure. Stay small, stay flexible, stay hidden. Do not become indispensable. The irony is sharp. The very efficiency that made the Templars powerful made them vulnerable. Those who learned from their fate ensured they would never repeat it on the same scale. So when we look at later brotherhoods and wonder whether the Templars survived within them, we may be asking the wrong question. Survival does not require identity. It requires memory. And memory, once embedded in ritual, symbol, and story, can travel far beyond the reach of courts and fires. The Templars' blood may have diluted over generations. Their name may have become legend. But the way they thought, the way they organized loyalty, secrecy, and purpose, continued to surface whenever people sought meaning outside imposed authority. In that sense, the Templars never needed to return. They were already everywhere, not as knights in armor, but as a quiet inheritance passed from hand to hand, lodge to lodge, family to family, a reminder that some orders do not end. They simply stop being visible. By the time the 15th century unfolded, the echoes of the Templars' influence had begun to seep into corners of the world where few suspected. Their disappearance, sudden and complete in France, had left voids in wealth, knowledge, and power. Yet wherever the order's former members, traditions, and expertise survived, they adapted, morphing into forms that were less conspicuous but no less effective. These adaptations did not always take the shape of organized orders or formal institutions. Often they manifested as networks, fluid, resilient, and almost invisible to those who lacked access. One of the most compelling places to trace these networks is the Iberian Peninsula. The Order of Christ in Portugal, founded from the remnants of the Templars, had established not just continuity, but a platform for expansion. Their members were no longer primarily warriors for the Crusades. They were custodians of maritime knowledge, finance, and strategy. The skills that had been honed in the Mediterranean navigation, supply logistics, and tactical coordination were now applied to the emerging Portuguese exploration of Africa and eventually the Atlantic. The transition from European crusading to global exploration is often portrayed as linear, as if maps, ships, and ports were suddenly harnessed for discovery. But in reality, this knowledge was centuries in the making, accumulated carefully by an order trained to survive under extreme threat. The Templars had understood how to move men and treasure across seas safely, how to anticipate danger, and how to operate beyond the reach of conventional authority. These lessons were embedded in the practices of the Order of Christ and became critical to Portugal's maritime ambitions. At this stage, it becomes impossible to ignore the connection between disappearance and deliberate preservation. When Templar assets vanished from France, they were not lost in chaos. They were relocated, redistributed, or memorized by trusted members. This principle of dispersal, whether in wealth, knowledge, or personnel, created a system of redundancy. Unlike a king's treasury or a centralized archive, the Templar network could survive destruction without leaving a single clear trace. The very act of disappearance was, paradoxically, a demonstration of foresight and control. The psychological dimension of this survival is equally important. The Templars had been trained to operate under secrecy, to trust in hierarchical but compartmentalized information flows, and to anticipate betrayal. When they faced annihilation, these practices were not abandoned, they were amplified. Ships vanished, documents were hidden, and knowledge was encoded in ways that could be accessed only by those initiated into the Order's inner workings. What was lost to the world remained alive within a closed circle of custodians, ensuring continuity despite appearances of destruction. This continuity was not limited to Europe. As Portuguese navigators began to chart the coasts of Africa, islands in the Atlantic, and eventually the Americas, the question arises: who carried the knowledge that enabled these voyages? The idea that this expertise originated with the Templars is not fanciful. Their network had been designed to move not only treasure but strategy, instructions, and intelligence. In Portugal, this institutional memory found fertile ground, preserved in lodges, ports, and ships that became extensions of the Order's logistical mind. Yet survival required adaptation, and adaptation demanded discretion. The Templars' identity could not survive in Europe under its original name. The Order of Christ was a legal and symbolic reinvention that allowed them to continue their work under the aegis of the Crown. This transformation is critical to understanding how knowledge and influence persisted. Publicly, the Templars were gone. Privately, their methodology, discipline, and networks were embedded in institutions that could operate openly and strategically without drawing suspicion. Beyond Portugal, remnants of Templar influence may have persisted in Scotland, where the Order had never been formally suppressed. Scottish clans and emerging fraternal organizations absorbed some of the Order's practices. Emphasis on secrecy, ritualized loyalty, and the transmission of knowledge through symbols and oral instruction. Here, as in Portugal, survival did not require visibility. It required subtlety, patience, and careful selection of those entrusted with continuity. Those who retained knowledge did so cautiously, understanding that exposure could once again prove fatal. The interplay between disappearance and secrecy had another critical effect. It created ambiguity. By vanishing from the public eye, the Templars ensured that history could not fully account for them. Questions about missing ships, hidden treasure, and surviving members could not be answered definitively, even centuries later. This ambiguity became a tool of preservation. By making their movements and assets unknowable, the Order prevented rivals from consolidating control over what had once been their power base. In essence, disappearance became both shield and strategy. Even in the Caribbean and across the Atlantic, where rumors and later legends suggest possible Templar presence, the same principles apply. Ships that might have carried knowledge, treasure, or personnel would have moved quietly, using routes understood only by experienced navigators. Settlements, if established, would have been small, concealed, and integrated into existing social frameworks. The Templars' legacy in these regions, whether in tangible artifacts or procedural memory, would have been deliberately subtle, resisting discovery and discouraging speculation. The survival of this legacy also relied on the cultivation of trust. Knowledge, once dispersed, needed guardians who understood its value and the risks of disclosure. Those entrusted with this information were often former knights or trusted affiliates who had internalized the Order's discipline. They were instructed in what could be revealed, what must be hidden, and how to encode meaning so that only the initiated could interpret it. These practices mirror broader principles observed in the movement of the Templars' treasure and ships: compartmentalization, redundancy, and selective disclosure. What emerges from this analysis is a pattern. The Templars' disappearance was not a single event but a process. It was executed through a combination of foresight, logistics, secrecy, and the strategic distribution of knowledge and assets. This process ensured that even after public destruction, the Order's influence could persist in multiple forms, within European institutions, maritime networks, emerging societies, and symbolic traditions. The vanishing was, in reality, a transformation, one that preserved the essence of the Order while discarding the liabilities of visibility. This perspective challenges conventional historical narratives. The focus on trials, executions, and confiscated property often obscures the larger reality that the Templars' disappearance was a form of survival. It reframes questions about missing ships, hidden treasure, and unknown refuges as evidence of deliberate strategy rather than mere legend. By interpreting these actions through the lens of continuity, foresight, and operational logic, a coherent pattern emerges. A pattern that suggests the Templars, though seemingly erased, continued to shape events and institutions from behind the scenes. Finally, the implications of this ongoing influence extend beyond the material. It reveals an order not merely concerned with territorial control or wealth accumulation, but with knowledge, methodology, and cultural memory. Their disappearance, paradoxically, allowed these elements to endure longer than visible power could have. Ships vanished, castles fell, names were erased, but procedural knowledge, maritime expertise, and symbolic frameworks, passed through networks and institutions, remained active, influencing exploration, trade, and even the formation of later fraternal organizations. In this sense, the Templars' disappearance was both an ending and a beginning. It ended their visible authority in Europe, but it began a diffusion of influence that was resilient, adaptive, and enduring. Where others saw defeat, the Order had ensured survival. Where historians see absence, there existed continuity. And where the world assumed the end of a powerful order, the principles that had made the Templars exceptional quietly persisted, ready to re-emerge whenever circumstances demanded discretion, discipline, and the preservation of knowledge. Across the centuries, few questions have captured the imagination as persistently as the mystery of the Templars' final days and the fate of their vanished ships. It is a question that straddles history and legend, fact and speculation, yet it is rooted in the realities of medieval strategy, survival, and secrecy. The ships themselves, large and capable, represented more than vessels. They were lifelines, conduits of wealth, knowledge, and influence. Their disappearance is not merely a curiosity. It is central to understanding how the Templars navigated the collapse of their order and ensured the survival of their legacy. These ships were built for utility first, not show. Medieval records, although sparse, suggest that Templar vessels were designed to carry men, horses, and cargo across long distances. They were sturdy, navigable in both Mediterranean and Atlantic conditions, and crewed by sailors who understood the subtleties of tides, currents, and seasonal winds. Unlike merchant ships, they operated as part of an integrated network, coordinated across ports, commanderies, and fortified harbors. The disappearance of such a fleet could not have been accidental. It required foresight, planning, and precision. The timing of the disappearances is critical. The arrests in France were synchronized across regions to prevent coordination and escape. Yet when royal agents arrived at key ports, the ships were gone. Contemporary accounts mention La Rochelle in particular, where the fleet should have been concentrated and visible. The docks were quiet, the warehouses intact, and the water empty. For a monarch as meticulous as Philip IV, this was not merely frustrating. It was inexplicable. It implied prior knowledge, movement, and deliberate concealment. One key factor in understanding this vanishing is the Order's internal communication network. The Templars had perfected methods of transmitting information without reliance on official channels. Messages could be sent through coded correspondence, discreet envoys, and even symbolic signals embedded in daily routines. These methods allowed them to coordinate complex operations across continents. If the fleet had been prepared for disappearance, it is likely that such internal communication played a decisive role. Only a select number of individuals would have known the full plan, minimizing risk while maximizing efficiency. Another factor is logistics. Moving large ships and their crews along with cargo cannot be improvised. Supplies had to be loaded, routes planned, and tides considered. Any miscalculation could have exposed the fleet to detection or disaster. The Templars' prior experience transporting soldiers, horses, and treasure for crusades provided them with unparalleled expertise. They understood how to synchronize multiple departures, avoid scrutiny in foreign ports, and maintain secrecy even under the watchful eyes of rivals. Their maritime knowledge made disappearance not just possible, but probable. The question of destination is more complicated. Speculation ranges widely. Some argue that the fleet sailed north toward Scotland and the North Sea, seeking refuge in regions beyond the reach of Philip IV's authority. Others suggest south toward Portugal, where the Order of Christ would provide legal and institutional continuity. A more audacious theory posits transatlantic travel, with ships crossing into the unknown waters of the Atlantic and possibly the Caribbean. While controversial, this idea gains plausibility when one considers the Templars' mastery of navigation, their Atlantic-facing ports, and their need for absolute security. Whatever the destination, the purpose of the fleet must be considered. These ships were not simple transports. They were vessels of survival. Some may have carried treasure, securing the Order's financial independence. Others may have carried documents, contracts, or knowledge too dangerous to remain in Europe. And still others may have carried personnel, senior members, custodians of knowledge, or initiates tasked with preserving continuity. Each of these purposes aligns with the strategic mindset of the Templars, who had long prioritized foresight, redundancy, and compartmentalization. The disappearance also illustrates the tension between visibility and vulnerability. The Templars, once prominent, understood that being seen was dangerous. Their order had grown immensely powerful, attracting envy and fear. When faced with annihilation, remaining visible would have been catastrophic. By vanishing, they protected not only themselves but the Order's essential functions. The ship's absence was a defensive maneuver, a way to shift from vulnerability to control. In other words, disappearance was not defeat. It was strategy. Royal records, incomplete though they are, provide additional context. Officials searched for the missing ships, offering rewards for information, questioning harbor masters, and interrogating crews. Nothing yielded certainty. The precision of the fleet's disappearance frustrated Philip IV and reinforced the perception of Templar ingenuity. It also created the fertile ground for centuries of speculation, as later generations wondered how a seemingly doomed order could orchestrate such a flawless evacuation. The symbolism of the fleet's vanishing extends beyond strategy. Ships are extensions of an order's reach, power, and identity. Their absence suggests deliberate erasure, removing not just physical presence, but the perception of authority. In medieval Europe, where reputation and visibility were crucial to influence, the ability to vanish without leaving trace is extraordinary. It implies discipline, trust, and long-term planning, all hallmarks of the Templar ethos. Furthermore, the disappearance resonates emotionally and psychologically. For the monarchy, it represented loss of control and authority. For the Church, it underscored the limits of oversight. For surviving Templars, it was a lifeline, a way to ensure continuity despite destruction. These layered consequences make the fleet's vanishing both a practical act and a symbolic statement. Even in defeat, the Templars could assert agency. Speculation about the fleet also intersects with legend and myth. Tales of treasure carried away, secret voyages, and hidden lands began to accumulate shortly after the arrests. While many stories are fantastical, they reflect an enduring truth. The Templars' maritime expertise and secrecy left gaps in history that imagination eagerly filled. The absence of evidence became fertile ground for legend, precisely because the fleet's disappearance was so complete and deliberate. Finally, the missing ships exemplify the broader principle that survival often requires invisibility. The Templars had learned, through centuries of crusading, that power and secrecy are intertwined. The fleet's disappearance embodies this lesson. To protect knowledge, treasure, and people, one sometimes must remove them from the world entirely. Visibility invites attack. Absence preserves possibility. In sum, the vanished Templar fleet is more than a historical curiosity. It is a case study in foresight, strategy, and adaptation. It demonstrates the Order's mastery over both sea and circumstance, revealing how an institution facing annihilation could orchestrate the preservation of its essence. Their ships did not merely disappear. They executed a final, decisive maneuver that ensured the Templars' legacy would survive beyond fire, trial, and exile, leaving historians and enthusiasts alike to wonder not whether the Templars survived, but how they managed to do so with such precision and subtlety.